Just noticed I hadn't started my recording. Zach, did you say something? I saw your light blink.
No, I accidentally hit the button. My bad.
Okay, no problem. Just checking. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit play here on the first video, which this will be the theory. There's a little bit of practical in the second video. Fair forewarning, the one. So this is the theory, the lecture, and then there's a kind of a demo, as they call it. It's kind of going through a practical example with Android Studio. A lot of things in there are pretty dated when we get to the actual the second video. So when we go through the lab, I'll kind of go over, what some of the new things are. Part of that is that these were recorded before constraint layout was a thing, and before it was the default and most commonly used layout. In fact, before it even existed. But nowadays we do most of our stuff with constraint layout, so it's going to change a few things. So one of the things that means in these two videos, we're going to talk a little bit about relative layout. There's really not relative layout has basically been entirely replaced by constraint layout because they do basically the same function. They serve the same purpose, but constraint layout does it better. So don't focus too much on the details of relative layout in either of these videos, but focus on the rest of it. Cool.
Hi guys! In previous sessions, you have learned what is Android and how to create your very first project in Android Studio. Here, in this session, we will work upon views, layouts, and resources. I hope you remember how was the components we have learned in Android applications. There were activities, there were services, broadcast receivers, and notifications. But in this session, we will work upon the design part because Android application is incomplete without a proper appearance of the screen. So here we will cover the building blocks of views, view groups, view hierarchies, layouts, how we define them in XML and programmatically, and how we can put an event listeners on it. So what exactly a view is? Every Android application is made out of view. Views are building blocks for user interface. We have text views, buttons, scroll bars, and images views. These views have some properties as well. So they are specified dimensions, colors, the positioning. They also may have focus, and they could be interactive, invisible, or visible. So these are all the subclasses of views. So in Android, we have three ways to define the views. We have graphical interface with the help of layout editor. We have XML files where we can define a bunch of XML codes, and third is the programmatically with the Java code. So here in this example, we are going to work out with layout editor. As you can see on the left, we have views. We can drag and drop to the basic component, and we can set the properties from the right side. And this is the basic representation of using layout editor. So from layout editor, you can restore its size, you can put a constraint and handle the constraint, and of course, resizable bars are there, the constraint handles are there, so you can make changes from the layout editor on the views. So here is another type of views which you can define in the XML. So here it represents a bunch of code written in XML. On the top, we start with the tag. Here the tag is a text view tag. And also I have told you that these views will have the properties. And here you can see the list of properties which is set for the text view. The layout width, layout height, and at the last you can see the text style, which is bold. So this is how you can set the properties. Here are further examples of how to set the properties in XML. And the first, we have specified the property name and the property value to the right. Here the property name is the Android layout width. That will set a width for that component according to the match parent value. Now the match parent value will take the width from the parent tag and put it there. Next example, we have a text, how we can represent a text. In the previous session, we have noticed how to refer the string files. This is how we have defined the string files, and now we are referencing it in a text. Next, we have an ID. This ID should be unique for every component so that in activity we can specify specific action on this UI component. Here it's the third type of defining the view in the Java code. So here I have defined a text view. We have created a new text view object and specify it in the context. So this is specifying the context, the scope of that particular activity. Now we need to call that method setText for the object which we have created for text view, which will be passed the string inside it. Yes, so these are three ways to define the views. First, through layout editor, second through the XML, and third through the Java code. Now, you noticed in the previous slide that we have mentioned the context this. What is the context? Context defines the scope of a particular object inside it. It is a global information about an application environment. There are two ways to define the context. To get the context, we call get application context, and when we create the object, we call this to specify the scope of that particular object.
So it's worth noticing here, one thing that she doesn't note here. Context is kind of an important thing, and it's used in a lot of different places in Android. But there's a distinction between those two. So when you say get application context, you do actually get something a little bit different, because it's, as it says, is getting the application context. That application context does not refer to your activity. It is your kind of application-wide context. So we'll use that. That's something that we'll touch on and use more in Unit 3 in several weeks. But if you're using this, then you're getting the current activity, getting its context. So an activity context and application context are actually not the same. And in the latter example, if you're, say, working with a text view there, that text view constructor does actually require an activity context, not an application context. Cool. So just wanted to throw that out there, that there is a little bit of a distinction between that.
Inside the activity or an application. We have hundreds of different types of views already defined in Android framework. But still, if you need some more views to be designed, you can go for custom views. You can define your own views by using view class and create a subclass of it. So now the next is view group and view hierarchy. View group acts as a parent to contain all the views inside it. It acts as a container for containing the views. View group is a base class for layouts and view components. It is of scroll view, linear layout, and recycler view. A scroll view is the one which contains the view components in a scrollable view. Now, the next is linear layout. For the linear layout, we arrange the views in a horizontal or vertical rows. We have recycler views for the scrollable list of views or the view groups. Now, this is a representation of a view hierarchy, how we define the view groups and views inside it. On the very top of it, view group acts as a parent, a root element, to contain either a view group or set of views. It also contains a view group. That means it's a nested linear layout could also be placed inside a linear layout. And, of course, for without views, we cannot say that the linear layout is complete. So at the base, at the leaf, we always have views components. To understand this view hierarchy, we have this representation. On the top, we have a linear layout which acts as a view group. Inside it, we are defining three views. The first one is a button. Next, we have text view. And at the last, again, there is a button. So as you can see, on the top, we have view group, and inside it, there are views which is defined. View hierarchy and the component tree. When we are working with the layout editor, we can see this component tree inside it to get the better understanding of this view hierarchy. This is how we can see. So there is a linear layout on top and it has three views inside it, which is visible on the left. So there are best practices for view hierarchies. Arrangement of views hierarchy affects an application performance. So we have to take care while defining the view hierarchy. It should be minimal and as simple as possible. So it should not contain multiple nested linear layouts or multiple linear layouts inside it. It could be simple as possible. Use smallest number of code snippets and views inside it. Keep the hierarchy simple, and it should be neat also. Now, we are working with the layout. To understand this layout, we have layout views. Layouts specify the view groups. As I have told you, like there are scroll views, linear layouts, recycler views. These are the subclasses of view group only. It can be in a grid layout, a table, a linear layout, or a relative layout. Here is an example. The first one represents the linear layout. If you can see, inside it, it has 3 view components. These are horizontally aligned to each other. Next, we have relative layout. As the name suggests, relative. That means all the UI components are relative to each other, right? Next, we have third grid layout. Grids, we give it in a 2-dimensional layout and put the views inside it. And the table layout, it is specified like this. We can have rows and columns to be specified for each view component inside it.
So looking at those from the left to right. So one thing to note, linear layout can be horizontal or vertical. You can change the orientation of it. So the linear layout can either give you a bunch of elements, a bunch of views that are ranged going from top to bottom or left to right. Either of those are an option with linear layout. That's kind of your simplest, generally your simplest layout. You just want to put things in a line. Relative layout lets you kind of do anything. Pretty much most things can be done with constraint layout or relative layout. Grid layout is specifically, as you can kind of see, is for a grid if you want everything to be the same size. So if you want everything to be the same width and height, that's where a grid layout would come out. So for instance, if you're maybe showing a list of movies, kind of a grid of movies or a grid of products or things like that, that's where you're typically going to see that grid layout is when you have a list of things. That table layout isn't one that we're actually going to use at all this semester, just so you know. It's really been dated and replaced by constraint layout as well. Cool. Any questions on those 4 layouts?
Nope.
Okay.
And put the views inside it. And the table layout, it is specified like this. We can have rows and columns to be specified for each view component inside it. Here is a list of common layout classes which we generally use. There's a constraint layout. We put a specific constraint and that will remain fixed when we are working with multiple devices. That means multiple devices will come along with multiple screen sizes. So here is a constraint layout which put a constraint on a view and make it constraint throughout the devices. Next, we have linear layout. So linear layout, we can define the views either vertically or horizontally. Relative layout, that means the child views are relative to each other. We can place them relatively. Table layout, we can specify it in rows and column wise. Next, we have the frame layout. To show the views inside it, we use frame layout, like an example of an image gallery. We swipe out right, left, and to see the views inside a frame. We have a grid view, which contains a 2-dimensional views in a grid format. Next, we have class hierarchy and layout hierarchy. What is this? When we talk about a class, that means we are talking about Java. And in Java, the hierarchy follows the concept of inheritance. We have a superclass, then we have a subclass created out of it. Take an example. A button is a subclass of a text view, and a text view is a subclass of a view component. And view is already defined as an object. So there is a superclass subclass relationship. And when we talk about the layout hierarchy, we have defined it like view group, and it has view components inside it. We have seen that how we create an XML earlier in previous slides. Now, it's a proper representation of doing it with XML code. On the very top, we have a parent tag, which is linear layout, and it has set of properties, which is layout width, layout height, and of course, we have to specify the orientation when we are using the linear layout. Inside linear layout, now we are going to define views. So we have edit text, buttons, text views inside it. And as we know that if we open a tag, we have to close it also. So after containing the views inside it, we close the tag in XML. This is how we represent it in a Java code. So for first, we define an object for the linear layout. Now, as I have told you, that we also have to set an orientation for the linear layout also. We set it like this way. Next, we now want a view object, that is a text view. So we create a text view object and specify the context for this particular activity. And we now need to set a text also on the text view. So this is how we define it. Next, we have to add this text view inside our linear layout. So with the help of add view method, we define this my text object and add it into the linear layout. At the end, we set content view, which is an activity code method, and put a linear layout inside it. So in the previous slide, we have seen how we can create an object for the linear layout and for the text view, and also how to add the text view inside that linear layout. Here, if I have to set a width and height of that particular view, this is how we do it. We call the layout param object. We create a layout param object. So first we specify the height. So first we specify the width, and next we specify the height. The match parent will take the width of the parent tag, and wrap content will take a height of according to that component size. And after this, we need to call a set layout param method for this.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Lalit Singh. So now you have seen views, layouts, how you deal with your UI components. Now we need to make them alive. Let alone putting a text view or button will not do any good for you if you design your application. You need to interact with them. So that's when event handling comes in. To understand it better, we are going to take a look at dad and daughter analogy. Let's see. Now let's just take a look at dad and daughter analogy to understand event handling even more better. So here we have a room and we have a shop. Now inside room, there's a daughter and there's a dad. Now daughter asks for a chocolate. For that request to complete, dad needs to present inside the room. So here, if I start comparing with my event handling, daughter is my event source who asks for chocolate. Dad is my event listener who listens to that event. And to complete that request, dad needs to go to the shop and buy one chocolate. So a shop here is considered to be event handler. So this scenario helps us to understand that this is how event handling goes. There is always an event, there is a listener to listen that event, and there will be a handler to handle that event. So now you have seen dad and daughter analogy, so you know now that you need three things to handle your events. One, the event source. Second, your event listener. Third, your event handler. So event source can be any view. It can be a button, it can be a text view, it can be a list view. So anything, or even can be a click event, even can be a long click event, or even can be when you are dragging something. So that's what the event is. And to listen for those events, you need listeners. And once an event has been listened by an event listener, then you need handlers to handle those methods. So a handler is basically a method which is defined inside your event listener. To handle your click events in Android, there are two ways, XML and Java. So when we are handling in XML, we can put that in an attribute named onClick. So a click event can be generated by any view. So you just have to put an attribute onClick and give the method name. Give a name. It can be any name. Do something, show toast, do message, and then that same method you have to put that in your Java file. So for example, let's say I have a event or I have a view and I have defined on click inside that. So show toast is the method I have defined in XML. Now I will go back to my Java, and inside that Java I will put show public void show toast, and the attribute will be a view object, and inside that I will put the code whatever I want to happen when that or that event or that view has been clicked. So here I can show a toast. Toast is an interactive dialog box which will be only used to notify the user. We will see in practical how exactly a toast looks like, but how exactly you define, you can see that toast, we create an object of toast, and we make a toast by providing 3 arguments, by putting a context object that is that would be defined inside your activity, this, and then putting the message, whatever the message you want to show. Here hello toast will be shown, and then the duration. A toast can be only shown in 2 ways, long and short. Long will show it for 3 to 4 seconds, short will show it for 1 second, and at the end you have to show a toast by putting toast.show. Now there was how to handle in XML, but when we talk about Java, in Java you need to have a ID for that particular view. When we say ID, you need to know that which view you are handling. Let's say I want to handle a button. Now at that point in time, that button has been defined in your XML file, so you need to get the access of that button in your Java file. So that's when there's a method to do that known as find view by ID, and this method will give you the access of your that same button which you have defined in your XML with the same ID. Then once you get the access of that button, then you need to put your listener, then you need to attach your listener to this button. So here the listener name is set on click listener, and inside that listener we have a handler method known as public void on click, and this is where you will put the code to show something or do whatever you want when you want to click a button, when you want to click a view. This is where you put the functionality what you want when you click on a view. Now let's just talk about resources. How exactly we can define our resources in the REST folder. First of all, why do we need resources? Why do we need to define resources separately? If we can define them directly on our views, or if we can define directly them on our text views or any view. Well, it gives you it gives you a property of localization. You don't have to define that property again and again in coming views, incoming properties, or incoming wherever you want to use that resources again. So a resource can be a string, a resource can be a dimension, a resource can be image, audio file, text file. So that where exactly you will be putting the resources? You will be putting the resources inside your REST folder, and you can put them in any XML file with a tag resources. So REST is the folder where you will be putting all your resources, and how you access your resources, especially if it is a layout one. So you will be accessing your layout resources by using r.layout. The name of your resource file which you have defined inside your REST folder. As in my case, it happens to be activity_main. So you must have seen this kind of example in your you must have seen this kind of coding in your examples also. We do set content view r.layout. Your activity_main. So what exactly is that? I'm accessing my resource file from my REST folder, and whatever you do inside your REST folder, it gets saved in your r.java file. Next, view. In the similar fashion, if you want to access any view which you have defined in your REST folder or inside your UI or layout file, and you want to get the access of that view inside your Java file, that's when you use find view by ID, and again you make use of r.id. Whatever the ID you have given for that particular view. And if you want to use a string in Java, you will use r.string.title. You will use the dot operator in Java. But if you want to use that same string in your XML, that's where you will use the @ annotation. That's where you will use @. @ will directly refer to your r.java file, and from there you will follow that which class you want to access, like string slash whatever the ID name you have given or whatever the name you have given to that particular resource. When we talk about measurements, when you want to define any view size or for any image size, so that's when you will be using DP, known as device independent pixels. Now, whenever you are defining the size of your font or text, that's when you will be using SP, that is scale independent pixels. Now, do not make use of all these units, pixels, or points. These are not allowed in your Android. To learn more about the views, you can follow these links, or about layouts, you can follow developer.android.com. And about if you want more information about resources and other stuff, we have links here to go about it. Next, we will see the actual implementation of views, event handling in the practical.
So that's the theory component. I'm going to jump over and pull up the practical, the demo part. Any questions so far on the theory perspectives? I think they'll start making a lot more sense as we jump in and actually start building things. But questions right now?
Nope.
Not for me.
He did mention those two units, DP and SP. Remember, DP stands for density pixel or density independent pixel, and SP stands for scaled pixels. It's worth noting that those will be the units that we'll use for anything, anytime we're doing measurements. We're only going to use those two units. DP is specifically, use it for anything that's not the size of text. Size of text will always be SP. Everything else will be DP. The reason for the difference there, there's a setting in Android that you can use to make font sizes bigger across the entire system. And when you make the font size bigger, you don't want any other things to get bigger, just the text. So the SP is basically pulls in that multiplier and applies it to the size of a DP. So, for instance, if let's say a DP one DP is 1 pixel, equates to 1 pixel on your device, and you set the scaling on the font to be 200 times, that means that 1 SP actually is 2 pixels, not 1 pixel. So that's where SP comes in there. It's just an accessibility feature for people to make the font size on their Android devices bigger. That's it. Cool. But in order to support that, that font scaling, that's where we as developers have to set the font sizes, the text sizes in SP instead of setting them in DP. Another thing worth noting there, DP, and you may want to write this down. DP is, there's kind of a lot of documentation out there on different things related to screen density and screen resolution. The way DP is defined is roughly as such. Roughly 160 DP is 1 inch. It's not exactly true because the screen resolution is never exactly reported, so it's not exactly an inch, but 160 is roughly an inch. Cool. So DP you can kind of think about as being roughly equivalent to inches.
Okay, now let's just take a look at the practical of layout, views, and event handling. So I'm going to create a new project for that. Name it views and events. I'm going to create an empty activity, and the name of my main activity will be main activity, and the XML file will be activity underscore main. Let the Gradle build the project. Okay, once the Gradle has been built, we can design our UI now. So for this particular application, I will be making my title as UI and events, and I will be changing my attributes here. So this is the way you design your UI with layout editor, which we just saw in our slides. So you can drag another UI.
So you'll notice that there's a few things that are different, especially as we get into current version of Android Studio. You'll notice that things up on top there, this area looks a bit different because in recent versions of Android Studio that has changed, especially with the switch to constraint layout being the default. If you kind of look here, you can see the view hierarchy, and you'll see at the top is relative layout. It used to be that anytime you created a new activity, a new layout, the default layout that it would start out with would be relative layout. Nowadays it starts automatically with constraint instead of relative. So you're
With what? What'd you say? It's constraint?
Constraint layout. So your root, when you create a new activity or a new layout, is going to be constraint layout, not relative layout.
Okay, I thought it was linear, and what? Yeah, I still remember that being one of the choices. But
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that will be the one that we'll use the most. Honestly, most of our layouts will be constraint layout because it's actually, as it turns out, constraint layout is the one that scales best to different screen sizes.
So you can drag another UI, let's say a button, or you can drag another text view and keep it anywhere or place it anywhere you want on your layout. So if you check out the component tree right now, the root layout here is relative layout, and inside relative layout there are two text views. One I have already defined as title, another one I have just dragged and dropped. So this first one you can always give the ID like my title. It's a good practice to give the ID to all your UI components. So the second one is again another text view. Now you can always go ahead and change the properties of this text view also. So you can always go ahead and change the properties from the right pane, and there you will find all the properties to change. Take any screen size, maybe 30 sp or 36 sp. Like we discussed, for text views or for font size we will be using scaling pixel. Or you can always go to the coding part. This is the design part, layout editor. If the second part is your coding part. If you go to the text part, here you will see that you can even decide all the attribute from here. Let's say I want to change the color. Android text color. And I want to use a color which is already defined in my color resources. So you see, from your text part also, or from your XML part also, I can actually change my views or change my properties of views. So here now I will change it your text. Sorry, your text. Now, here, what exactly my example gonna do? I will put two buttons here and call it change 1, and I will put another button and let's just call it change 2. And on the click of both of these buttons, my text view is going to be changed. Now, before I define my click listeners to that, let's just define the IDs to these views. Like I told you, it's a good practice to define IDs to each and every view, because if you want to use these views later on in your Java file, you can always do that. So in the ID of this text view, I will put it T1. Press yes. In this button, I'm putting B1. And in second button, I'm giving B2. So the first button I will be handling with my Java way, that is my coding way. The second one I will be handling with my XML way. We just saw that there are two ways to handle the buttons or on-click listener or the click event. So we are going to see both of them. So first, when I want to handle my button with coding part, I will come to my Java code and I need to change my text view. So I need to get the access of my text view. For that, I will create a text view reference, and I know my click listener or my event will be generated from a view known as button. So I will be needing the button reference also. Then to refer these views directly from your XML file, I need to use a method named findViewById. So findViewById, it returns me an object form, so I need to typecast it to text views. So how do I get the access of that same text view? For that we have r.java file, and we will do r dot, because it's an ID, so r.id dot t1. And now this t1 or this text view is referring to this same text view. So that's what our goal is, to refer exactly the same text view which you have defined in your layout. In the same way, I can refer to the same button also by defining button. Find view by ID r.id.b1. After that, next, when we are doing it with coding, I need to put a listener to listen that, because as of right now there is only an event source, that is button. So to put the listener, I need to do implements on click listener, and please make sure that you are putting on click listener of view class, not the dialog interface class. That will be covered when we reach to the dialogs. So view.onClick listener class, and it will give you error because onClick listener is an interface, and interfaces in Java have set of abstract methods which you need to implement. So when you click on this balloon, red balloon, and it will give you all the abstract methods which are there in this particular interface. You just have to press OK, and those methods will be implemented for you. So now there is a listener, there is a handler, but still you need to register your event source with your listener. That is, you need to register your button with your listener. So how do you register? Set on click listener and put this. Now this here means that you're handling this particular listener inside this class only, inside this main activity only. That's the reason I'm putting this here. Now, all I need to do now is to put the code to change your text view inside your on-click handler. That is, so how do I change my text view? So I have the reference of text view T1. All I need to do is set text and put the name, put whatever the text you want. You clicked button 1, and that's it. So now if you run this application, with your emulator, it will look exactly the UI you have designed for your main application, and this will have two buttons, but the second button will not work right now because you haven't really given any listeners, or you haven't really handled your second button. But your first button, if you click on your first button, see here, you clicked button 1. So that's it. You have handled your first button. Now let's just take a look how exactly we can handle my click events in an easier way. So we just saw the Java way. Now let's just talk about the XML way. So in XML way, all you have to do is just click on your button and press Control and click on that, and it will transfer you to your coding part. And inside that, all you have to do is just put an attribute name on click and give any name. Maybe do something. It can be do task. It can be change text. Whatever you are putting here, whatever the function name or whatever the name you are putting here, just copy this name and put the same name inside that activity where you are using this layout. So the signature of that function will be public void do something, and inside that, the attribute will be view. And inside this, now you can handle this button separately. Now set text, you clicked button 2. So you see, now you don't need a listener, you don't need to give an ID or get the access of button. Everything has been taken care by this particular on-click attribute. So now if you run this, this button also has been handled by the way of XML. So if you click on change 2 now, it will show you click button 2. If you click on change 1 now, it will show click button 1. So that's how you handle your events and UI.
So you've seen there's two different ways to, in general, handle events. There's actually more than that. I'd say all told, there's probably 4 different ways to do it. But basically it falls into either you can implement it with the on-click attribute in XML, or you can use a click listener object in Java and do it programmatically. And then the catch is that there's a few different ways to do it programmatically, not just the way that he showed. For the most part, we will be using the XML route to define our click listeners. When we get down to recycler views, and in general, if you're kind of dynamically doing some stuff with the UI, then sometimes you need to use the ladder method of on-click listeners. So if your recycler view is one of those where we'll see the on-click listener the programmatic way. We'll also see that with dialogues that we have to do it the programmatic way as well. Cool.
I didn't quite get the Java way. I didn't see how they were connected. The listener and the action. I didn't see how clicking B1 leads to a change in text for that particular one. I mean, I see that it worked, but
let's talk about it further when we get into the actual.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Let's review that when we actually go into and have some code in front of us.
Okay. And view. I didn't get that either.
Yeah. Well, the first, remember when you're talking about parameters, the first word, right, is the data type of it. The second thing is the name of that variable. So it's the data type of the parameter and then the name of the variable. So the first one is view, as in the view class, and then lowercase view is the name of the variable was called view.
Okay. I just didn't see where it was defined. That's all.
Yeah.
All right. We'll handle it later.
Yeah, it's what it is. Again, it's a parameter, so it's not defined. It's defined there. You know, where the view actually comes in there is somewhere else. And as it turns out, the view that you always get there is the thing that triggered the event. So in that case, the view is equivalent to the button because the button is the thing you clicked on. All right, so let's take a quick break. We'll come back at 1:40. We'll jump into Android Studio and we'll work through the 1.2 code lab. I think there's actually 2 for today, 1.2a and 1.2b. So we'll work through both of those.
With our tablets we're issued, I realize that all the stuff will be erased later, but can we kind of make those our own, like sign into the Play Store and all that, or is it better not to do that?
You can totally do that if you want to. That's fine. But yeah, at the end of the semester, I'm gonna wipe them.
I use mine for YouTube whenever I'm not using it to code.
That's fine. Feel free.
It's actually really handy to have it over to the side, kind of as background noise.
All right. Grab yourself some food. I'll see you back in a few minutes. We'll get that going in about 4 minutes. Breaks are always so awkward when we're like online. Who's here and who's not. Okay, welcome back. It's 1:40, so we're gonna get going again. But you had a chance to get some food, stretch your legs.
Stretch my legs and get some food.
Good. All right, so as I kind of mentioned previously, we'll be going through 1.2a as well as 1.2b. So if you're looking and following along with the code labs, that's where we'll be. Okay, so I'm going to jump into 1.2 Part A. We can start up at the top and kind of see what the plan is for what we're going to build today in this lab. So we're going to build this program called Hello Toast. You'll notice that in the center, it's got kind of a text area. Or a text field that's kind of yellow in background, and it's basically a counter. So what's going to happen is every time you hit count up here, that counter will go up by 1. And if you hit the toast, then you'll see a little toast message like this kind of pop up. Okay, so that's the program that we're building. We're also going to look a little bit about, I think this is more in the second part of this, 1.2b. We'll look a little bit about how do you build a landscape version and a tablet version of this to support other screen sizes. But this first version that we're going to build, we're just going to target the Nexus S in portrait orientation. Okay, so we're going to start by creating our project in Android Studio. So obviously you want to open up Android Studio, end up and running. You'll see that there's a table up at the top that gives you kind of some information about how to start the project, and you'll see the same kind of information on most of these labs from here on out. Remember, if it says API 15, we're always going to start these at API 21. And I'm waiting for it to start. There we go. So let's jump in here, create a new project. Put this off to the side. So we can see that the start is going to be an empty activity, as we're going to be used to for a little bit here. You'll notice that it says the application name should be Hello Toast, and you'll notice that there's a space in there. So I'm going to put that in. You'll notice that my package name is ed Ranken PR Smith Hello Toast. You notice it's generally going to remember that first part, and so you usually won't have to change that once you've done it the first time. We do have to pay attention to, though, what folder is it that's going to put this into?
1.2.
Right, 1.2. What folder does it show here?
1.1.
1.1. So I need to go change that to 1.2 to make sure it goes to the right place. Okay. So 1.2 Hello Toast is where we're going to put it. And then this is inside my repo. Language is Java, API 21. Okay. Everybody got that? When you get those things entered, go ahead and hit finish. Okay, so once you get into the layout editor, please thumbs up my post on Discord. So everybody's ready to go.
Mr. Smith, what is that? Why is one teal and the other one's gray or white or some other color?
So there's two different views here, and it looks like one of these hasn't loaded yet. So I think I want to actually push this to my Nexus S because it hasn't built yet. I think if I push it to my Nexus S, this will switch over. There it goes. So sometimes if you're getting kind of a build there, it's showing the name of the layout, like constraint layout, like it was, you may need to actually run it and get it running on your emulator to fix that. So you're asking about why is there two views for the same thing, right? This is just one screen. Why do we have two different looks at it? So what you're seeing here, these are, yes, they're the same screen, but they're kind of, they're different ways to look at it. So the one on the right is what we call the blueprint view. And the one on the left is what we call the design view. So you'll notice right now I have this kind of stack. It looks like 2 stacked blue squares. That's because it's set to design plus blueprint. If I were to just switch this to blueprint, it's just going to give me the blueprint view. Similarly, I could go to design and it'll just give me the design view. So that it can be helpful if you're limited on screen space, is to go to one of those two. But I kind of like to, whenever I can, actually have both. The benefit of having this here, the blueprint view doesn't show you colors and it doesn't show a lot of other details. But it does give you a very good look at where the constraints are, how your layout, how your controls are actually laid out. So it gives you a very good look at the constraints, which are these kind of arrows, these springs that you see around here. So you see Hello World has these 4 springs around it. Those are all constraints. Yep.
Never mind. That's kind of too far ahead. Never mind.
Okay. So we'll be adding those as we go along. And you'll notice that over on the design view, those springs don't always show up. The constraints don't always show up. They only show up when I kind of hover over the control. So that can, that gives you a better view of what it's actually going to look like on the device. But it doesn't give you a good look at all of the constraints. Does that make sense? So this gives you a better look at the constraints. This gives you a better look at what it's actually going to look at like on the device. So that's why both of those are there, and they have their plus and minuses. You can also click in here. If you go to fade unselected views, that's going to have a little different behavior. No, that's not what I was wondering. One of the things that I often end up doing is under this eye view, there's a show system UI. I generally find it useful to have that on there. Without that, it doesn't show you where the toolbar are. You've got the system bar up here. You've got this what we call the action bar up there. Those always take up a certain amount of your screen space, and oftentimes I find if I don't have those on, then I'll make my screens a little bit bigger than what they can actually fit on screen. So I generally want to turn that on. So I can actually get a good view of how much screen real estate I really have. So that's not turned on by default, but I usually find it helpful to turn that on.
That's fixed by device.
What do you mean?
The banner, I guess, or you said the system up there, the hello. Yeah, with the time and the battery and the signal and all that.
So that the darker bar is called the status bar, and the second bar is called the action bar.
The action bar is part of the app, though.
Yes, the action bar is part of your app. The system bar is technically not, although your app is able to change the color of that. So in this case, we've actually changed the status bar to dark purple. Normally, it would not be that color. So normally you can kind of see it's transparent here. But every app actually gets to decide the color of the status bar. So we do have a little bit of control over it. And there's also ways to hide that status bar as well. Okay, the next thing you may want to do before you get too far into designing, if you go up to the drop down here, you can pick from a bunch of different devices and see it on those different devices. So for instance, here we want to probably look at it on our Nexus XS, which is that smallest device. Now that device is not on the list here under phones. You see that? There's no 4-inch device here. So oftentimes you may need to go look under the generic phones and tablets list. Does everybody see the generic list down at the bottom?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go in here, and you see it says 4.0 WVGA. That's how you're going to test against the Nexus S. So you're going to go into generic and 4-inch. that will then replicate it so it looks like what it's actually going to look like over here.
I saw there's one with just a 2.7-inch screen.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
That would be more in the category of a wearable. That would be closer to a smartwatch. I think that's on the kind of the bigger side of a smartwatch.
Okay. It just says generic phones and tablets. It doesn't say anything about
Yeah.
wearables. I was
Yeah.
curious.
When you get down to there, you're actually talking about smartwatches and such. You can kind of see it in the range here, like a round is 320 by 320, and this is 240 by 320. So, yeah, those smaller ones are more likely smartwatch. So you
I like
notice
the automotive side too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the automotive side's kind of an interesting animal. There's not a lot of vehicles that necessarily support automotive or Android devices on there, but there are some. So if you are actually building an app that run on cars, then you might play around with that. But automotive is very much out of the scope of what we're going to do this semester. There's definitely some other constraints and laws and legalities that you have to do to build for cars. So you'll notice that I picked as 4-inch WVGA, okay? But when I actually picked that, what does it show in the dropdown?
Nexus S.
Nexus S, okay? So unfortunately, some places in the UI it'll say Nexus S for that, and some places it will say 4-inch WVGA. The same thing happens for 10-inch for the 10-inch tablet. If you want to go test against a generic 10-inch, you can see it here, 10.1 Nexus 10. But when it actually shows it to you, it'll actually say Nexus 10, not 10-inch. So I'm going to go back to the 4-inch phone. Another thing that's very useful as you're playing around here, not only can you change the device that you're looking at, you can also change the orientation. So up here I can say, let's look at it in landscape orientation. So I can kind of preview what it's going to look like, not just in portrait, but also in landscape. So those are good things to keep in mind. Also, sometimes the API has some effect on how it looks. So for instance, if I want to look at what this would look like in 5.0, I can actually go pick 1 here, and it'll show me how it would look on API 21.
Generally, when you're developing, you want to do it on the oldest system. Our range is 21 through 29 or 30, I guess.
My experience has been that this drop down has very seldom doesn't have any effect. My experience has been that this drop down usually doesn't do anything.
Okay, but when we did our drop down before Nexus S API 21, you want the oldest, not the newest. Generally, is our main palette, I guess.
Yeah, what I would do is I would pick the generic one here, 4-inch generic. You notice that down at the bottom of the list, they have some options here with the virtual devices. I would not use these. The problem is my experience has been that using those, it generally switches between layout files when I don't want it to. So I would recommend against using those virtual device options at the bottom. I would stick with the generic option over here, because that seems to work better in general. Okay. So there's a few different things you can switch there. I'm going to go back to portrait because that's what we're going to start with. You can also in here notice you can change the language. So it's going to default to English US. As you add more translations to your program, say you have a Spanish version, you may want to preview it in Spanish, and that's where you would then switch this to Spanish. It would give you kind of a look at what it's going to look like in that language. So the biggest one there is to make sure before you do any development, before you work with the layout, make sure you switch it to Nexus S, and Portrait is the place you want to start. The other thing you will want to do before we start adding and laying out controls, you'll remember that in HTML there's something called a margin, and remember a margin is space between one component or one element and another element, right? It's kind of outside of the box. So initially, this drop down here, which kind of is as it specifies, is the default margin. By default, as you're building your UIs, it won't add margins, and that's usually not what you want, because then all your components will be butting up right next to each other, which doesn't create a good user experience. So you really always want to have some margin between all of your components on the screen. So to do that, I'm going to switch this over to 8, and then as I'm laying out components, it will automatically put in a margin of 8 instead of putting in a margin of 0 most of the time. Cool? So that's one thing you really want to remember before you start laying out your UIs, is to set the margin to 8. That will save you a lot of work before you get going. Okay, so we kind of saw a few things already. We saw over here we have the component tree. That's our view hierarchy. So we can see that the root, we have a constraint layout, and your root component will always be a layout of some sort. What layout it is can change, and you are able to change that from one thing to another. So for instance, I could go in here and say where is it? Convert view. And I could convert this whole layout, for instance, to a linear layout or a relative layout or any other kind of layout that I wanted to. Obviously, not the same things are supported on all of those, so not every layout is really convertible. But that is the way you can get in and change what that container is, what that root container is. Okay. You'll also notice that inside of here, and you see it's slightly indented, we've got the text view. So the text view is actually inside of constraint layout, right? So you can think of the constraint layout as our parent and the text view as our child. Okay. Any questions so far?
Nope.
So the first thing I want to do, now that we've kind of configured and shown you how to get around here, I want to get rid of this control here. I want to get rid of that text view. Any guesses as to how you're going to do that? How would you think to maybe get rid of that control? How would you remove it?
Press the delete button.
Yes, that's exactly what you're going to do. I'm going to select it, delete, and it's gone. So now I'm back to just an empty constraint layout, and that's usually where you're going to start. Is just go ahead and delete the label, the first label that's there. Okay. So let's go back here. So this is what we're going to build, right? So given that, I need to add some components in here, right? I need to put in some views. So what views do I need to make up this layout? And how many of them?
I'm not sure the terminology to use for this, but we need a container, right? Isn't it?
Okay.
A container that goes over it.
Which we do. That's our constraint layout.
Oh, okay. So it's basically that whole white thing, the whole white box.
The whole
that's on
area.
The edges are at the edge of the screen.
Yeah, the layout is what contains your other elements.
Oh, do we need a button?
We need a button. Okay. So if you look on the right, it's already pre-selected common. So you'll find most of the commonly used components up there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a button, I'm going to drag it in. See how it kind of drops in there? One thing I would say, there's a button here that looks like a magnet. Always leave that turned off. It does not work. And
what does
it does
it
not
do?
work well. What it's supposed to do is automatically add constraints. My experience is it never does the right thing. So I would recommend against using it. I always find it better to just put in the constraints myself. Usually creates more mess to have it try to auto connect things. Okay.
Mr. Smith,
Yep.
I think I missed something because I don't have that at the top. You see how you have that hello toast? I don't have that.
Because I went to the I and I clicked Show System UI.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. So I'm going to drag in a button. I'm also going to drag in a second button and have that down there at the bottom. Okay. And you'll notice that there's no springs in there right now. So there's no constraint. And for one, you can see this red exclamation. Anytime you see that, there's an error. And that's saying that right now we haven't constrained the views, right? So which means that there's no way for it to figure out where the views should be. So this application doesn't run until we've given it constraint. Okay, and specifically, in order for a constraint layout, every control, every view that you put in there has to have a vertical constraint and a horizontal constraint. The horizontal constraint gives it its position horizontally, and the vertical constraint gives it its position vertically. So you can think of one of those. The horizontal constraint gives it the x-axis, the x-coordinate, and the y, the vertical constraint gives it a y coordinate. Okay. So those are my two buttons. They're dragged in there. Okay. But I need to give them positioning. I need to give them constraints. Okay. So the way we put in constraints, first of all, I'm going to select one of these. Do you see the 4 circles around that?
Yeah.
Those handles are how you're going to create the constraints. Now, the direction of the constraints is important because you can drag, let's say I could drag a constraint from here to here. That's going to do one thing, and versus dragging a constraint from there to there actually does something different. So do pay attention to what direction the arrows go. Because when you're thinking about the direction, you're saying, well, this thing depends on the behavior of the other thing, right? So in this case, I want to say that the button, right, is placed relative to the layout. So I'm going to take the left side, drag that arrow, and I'm going to drag it over to the left side of the screen. Do you see that? So now what it's done is it's constrained the left side of the button to the left side of the layout. Everybody got that?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm going to do the same thing on the top. So I'm going to take the top, constrain it to the top. Now you'll notice in there, you can see the kind of number 8s on both of theirs, and you can see it's not butting up there. That's because I initially, had set this to a default margin of 8. If I had left that at 0, let me show you what happens if I put that at 0. These things are going to come right there, up all the way to the left side of the screen. See that? That's generally a problem. And part of why you don't want to do that is because oftentimes your screen protector, for one, your screen protector is usually going to cover the outer edges or make them harder to press. So you don't usually use the kind of 8 dp or 16 dp of the edge because it's probably going to be blocked by a screen protector. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Generally, we want to have margins there. So the way I need to go fix that, because I didn't set this to 8 dp initially, when I dragged that, I have to actually go click on it, and you see over here the constraints in this view, constraint widget. So I want to change these two that say 0. I'm going to change those to 8. And now it's problem fixed. The thing, though, is obviously if you don't set that initially, then you're going to have to come back and fix every constraint and change it 8. So changing that first at the beginning will save you a lot of effort rather than having to change each constraint one by one.
All right. Can you show how you did that again? Mine says match parent. I saw numbers there, though, before.
Look here. So right now, both of these the width and height, they should say wrap content. Wrap content. Wrap content just means that it should be as tall as it, or taller or wide as it needs to be. So wrap content for the width says just be as wide as you need to be to fit the content. Wrap content for the height just says be as tall as you need to fit the content.
I'm still not seeing it. The diagram. It's I see the layout drop down, and I'm clicking on all these different things, and
What do you mean you're clicking on different things?
Oh, all right. It's there now. I don't know.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. But it should say wrap content for both of those. You want to make sure that it says that. Okay. So we've got kind of a basic layout started. So I've got vertical constraints and horizontal constraints for both of these buttons. And if I were to run this right now, it's actually in a state where I can actually put it on the device and we can see what it's going to look like. So you can see there's a button in the top left corner and there's a button in the bottom left corner, right? Now notice if I turn it sideways, where are the buttons?
They're on the left side.
Still same left side, right? So it's fine, it works. But what I really want as far as this is concerned, right? Do I want it on the left side or the right side? Where do I want it?
In the middle.
I want it in the middle, right? So the mistake that a lot of people make is they go and say, I'm going to go change this margin, or I'm going to drag it. You can also get this by dragging it left or right. And I say, well, I'm going to drag it here about 1, 1, 2. I'm going to drag this about here. So it's roughly in the middle, right? Okay, but it's only roughly in the middle on this device. So let me just pull up let's say a different device. So I'm going to go to a 6-inch, maybe the Pixel 2a. Is it still in the middle?
No, because you got to add a constraint.
Right. So you'll notice that what I'm saying is that it should be 112 from the left, right? That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that it should be in the center. I'm saying that it should be 112 in the left. And that can be especially exaggerated. Let's say I go to my tablet. So I'm going to go to a 7-inch tablet, and let's look at landscape orientation, right? So let's say I set this up like here. That's roughly in the center, right? Roughly in the center? Everybody with me?
Yep.
Okay, but notice what's my margin right now. And go to the blueprint view here so we can see it. So notice my margin is 432 dp. Everybody see that? Now watch what happens if I go back to the Nexus S. Where are my buttons now? Are they in the center?
On the right side of the screen.
On the right side of the screen. And if I were to exaggerate this a little bit, let's say I'm going to go 600. Where's my button now?
In a new dimension.
Yeah, it's off the screen. It's, yeah, in a new dimension. So I want to be very careful when I'm moving these things around and dragging things, because as you see, as I drag things, it's going to set some very large margins, okay? If your I'm going to go ahead and go on a limb and say, if your margin is bigger than 16, you're doing something wrong. You should only ever be using a maximum margin of 16. Okay? What does that mean? That means we need to do, we need to set it a different way. Okay? So if you want to center something, the way to center it is not to give it a different margin. Does everybody understand that now?
Yeah.
So that's really, really important in terms of supporting different screen sizes. What you're going to do instead, remember that I said you have to have a vertical constraint and a horizontal constraint. But you only have to have at least one. In fact, you can actually have two. So in here, I'm actually going to add a second constraint, and I'm going to constrain the right side to the right side of the view. Does everybody see that now? I need to fix my margins so that they're back to 8. But everybody see I've got I've now got a constraint to the left side of the screen and a constraint to the right. Do you see that?
Yep.
So when you do that, it now is actually going to stay in the center regardless of the size of the screen. So if I were to take this and turn it back to portrait, you can see it's still in the center. And so that's what I want to do. If I need to center it between two things, then I need to give it two constraints, one on each side. Everybody with me?
I've been fiddling with this, and I cannot get two buttons to show up. It doesn't matter where they're at. They're right in the center of the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a problem with my configuration or what.
I would delete both of your buttons and add them back in.
Okay.
So I would just delete both of those two and add them back in. That's what I would do. Okay. So I have them centered now, right? And I can run them on the device and verify that that's the case. So we can look at it in portrait and we can look at it in landscape. Okay, they're centered here. Turn it sideways, they're centered there as well. So what I would like to do, and if we look at the kind of the expectation here, yes, it needs to be centered, but you also notice that you want it to be wider, right? Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a few ways to change the width. One of the ways that you can change the width is I can actually go here to the layout width field and say, well, let's set it to a fixed number. So let's say this is 200 dp. Okay, that will change the width, but now it's always 200 dp. Regardless of the size of the screen, it will always be 200 dp, but it will be at least centered, right? So that's one way that you can set the width, is you can set it with a fixed width. Remember previously the way we had this set was wrap content. Wrap content's going to set it based on the size of basically the text on the button. But in this case, I wanted to be the full width of the area. Okay, so the way that I do that, if you look in here, you see in the drop down, there's two suggestions: wrap content and match constraint.
Yep.
I'm going to change this to match constraint, which is equivalent to 0 dp. 0 dp is kind of a special value. So I'm going to set both of those to match constraint or 0 dp. Notice that that's different than match parent. Match parent is one that you only use. Match parent you use with linear layouts and relative layouts and other kinds of layouts. Match parent is not one that you can use with constraint layout. Constraint layout does not use match parent as a special value. Okay, so you can see if I set it to 0 dp, it's now the full width of that space. Everybody see that? Everybody got that?
Yep.
Okay, so the other way that you can change that is you notice that there's these symbols here inside of the square, and you can see how the top and bottom are these little arrows. So that represents wrap content. This squiggly here represents match constraint. So the other way you can change this is you can actually click on that and it will cycle through the different modes. So I click it once, it'll go to wrap content. I click it again. Now it's a fixed width of 95, and you can see the symbol that it's got there. So that represents a fixed width. And I can click it again and it'll go to match constraint. So you can either pick it from the drop down or you can cycle it with those buttons here. Cool? All right, so the next thing I need to add in my text view, which is that center area here. Okay. Any guesses as to what should I constrain my text view to? Because I want it to fill up all of this space here. How should I create my constraints now for the text view?
Put it to the 2 buttons on the 2 sides of the screen.
Okay. Now, the question is, should I put this arrow down like that?
No, it should be the other way around. The text view should move to the button.
Exactly. So that's important because it has a different, as you can see, it's kind of got a different behavior. So I need to anchor the text view to the top and bottom buttons, and then I need to anchor the left and right side to the left and right side of the layout. Everybody see that?
Can you do that again?
Yeah, I can. So let me delete the constraint. If I remember right, the way to delete the constraint is you have to hold.
I got it.
To delete a constraint, you have to actually hold down the control key and click on the link. Okay, so I'm going to fix my margins here so they're set at 8. And so we've got a kind of our basic setup there. Now, this text view is only this big, right? So how can I get it to fill up the full space? How can I get it to fill up that full space? What can I change?
Change layout width to 0 dp.
And same thing for the height, right? So now that I've done that, it's the full size. Cool? Now,
Cool.
I'm going to switch back to the design view so we can start looking at some of the colors. Okay. One of the things you'll notice here is, where is the text of this text view?
Top left.
It's in the top left. And the way this is right now, it's always going to be in the top left. But I actually want it in the center. Okay. I actually want it in the center. Now, one of the ways I could do that is I could go back to match constraint, and now it's back in the center, right? But the problem there is, let's go say I want to change the background color to yellow, which I can find that if I scroll down. You won't find it in the common attributes. You have to actually scroll down farther under all attributes. And under all attributes, you should find background here. You'll notice that there's one labeled background tint, and there's another one labeled background. So in this case, I want to use background. So in here, I'm going to pick yellow. So now I've changed the background color to yellow. But notice if I have it wrap content, that yellow is only filling in the place where the text view is. Everybody see that? So in order for me to actually have it the yellow fill that whole area, I do actually need those to be match constraint. Right? So we have kind of a contradiction in term, right? If I put it both to wrap content will put it in the middle, but I won't get the background where I want it. But if I put in match constraint, then it's going to be the size I need it, but but the text is not in the center. Does everybody see that? So sometimes there's some additional knobs you need to flip or work with in terms of getting text like this to the center. Everybody with me so far? Does everybody have what I have on my screen?
Yep.
Mine's pretty hosed up. I can't get any of the buttons to show up, and I tried changing the configuration. Now it won't even launch. I don't know. We'll probably have to work offline to get it working.
Yeah, I would delete your project and start over. That sounds like where you're at.
Okay.
I would just delete the project and start from scratch. That would be my recommendation. So what I want to do here and is go down to common attributes. There's one of the attributes I can use. You'll notice that there's a text alignment setting. Everybody see that? So I can use that to get it to align center, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to set it to text alignment to center. So that'll get it horizontally centered. But I also want to get it vertically centered. Okay. Now, to get it vertically centered, you have to dig a little bit. So there is a setting down here, and I believe it's layout gravity. So if you go down to layout gravity, I'm not seeing it here. Is it further up? No. It might just, there it is. It's in gravity. What were you saying?
No, I was gonna say there is one just called gravity.
Yeah, so gravity is the one I want. So gravity is one way to kind of change where things are aligned in terms of a control. So in this case, that's what I want. The way that this is actually implemented, gravity is actually implemented with a bit mask, basically, where you're turning bits on and off. So that's why there's a bunch of checkboxes here, because you can check those bits or uncheck those bits. So if I click center, that actually checks the bits for both center vertical and for center horizontal. But that's all I need to do here, is I need to click center. Gravity center will get you to where you need to be. Alternatively, as I kind of mentioned, center vertical and center horizontal, doing those two together has the same effect.
Why is mine saying false still while yours says true?
What do you mean?
Whenever I click center underneath layout gravity, it it check marks it, but it still says false next to it.
Did you click here on the text, or did you click on the checkbox? Because notice if I click the text, nothing happens.
Yeah, I click the checkbox.
Okay. And the box is checked now?
Yes, it is.
I don't know then. You might try just typing in the word center up in this field and hit enter.
Are you underneath layout gravity or just gravity?
Just gravity.
Okay, that's my issue then.
Yeah, I'm under gravity. Okay, so we've got the layout mostly there. One of the things you'll notice also is that the font size here is pretty big. So I want to do that as well. So that will be under common attributes up here. I'm going to go and change the text size. Okay, and you'll see it's kind of defaulting, saying that it's defaulting to 14. So that's kind of a hint. I'm going to go in here and maybe, let's say, change it up to 36. Let's try maybe 72. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So I'm going to go up to 72. You can see that makes the text a lot larger. And the other thing I want to do is change the actual text that's showing up there. So you'll notice that initially I want it to start out at what value?
0.
I want to start it out as 0. Okay. So I can change that there to 0. Okay. Now, does everybody see that there's actually two attributes named text?
Yep.
Okay. Two attributes named text. That is actually important. These two fields text don't work the same way. So let me put some different text in here, and we can kind of see where these apply. So I put the text runtime and the text designer here. Now you'll notice which of those two appears here.
Designer.
Right? So the one with the wrench here is the one that shows up in the designer. Okay. Now, if I run the application, notice it's the other one that appears. Do you see that? So one sets what text you see in the designer, another one changes the text that initially appears when you run the application. Everybody got that? So generally speaking, in this case,
not.
Yep. Huh? What were you saying, Zach?
I said I do not here. I think I'm a little bit behind because I
Okay.
cannot find where this.
I'm under common attributes.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. But
Make sure you have the text field selected.
Yeah. If you have one of the other ones, if you have a different control selected or you have the constraint layout, you're not going to see the same behavior. Notice I have the text view selected.
Yeah.
So what I want to do, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to leave this version that's the runtime. I'm going to actually leave that one blank and set the one in the designer to 0. So what that means is initially, so here as I'm looking at it in the designer, it's going to show up as 0, but it's actually going to use that 0 when the application runs. That's going to help me solve kind of some common problems in here where these may have some, some discrepancy where the number basically that you're storing as the state can be not the same as the value that you're showing to the user. So initially, I don't want to show a value. I'm going to make that 0 come up using code. Does that make sense? So when the application runs, I'm actually going to use Java code, backend code, to make that change to 0. Okay. So let's finish up laying out the buttons, right? So you'll notice I still have the buttons saying button. Does everybody see that? Still haven't changed the text. So we need to go change the text on there. So I'm going to change this to the text of that top button to toast. And I'm going to use the one without the wrench there. And change this one to count. Now, one thing you might notice here, notice how I've kind of done this camel cased, uppercase C, lowercase. Notice, however, that it's being represented differently. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
So in the normal theme, all the text on your buttons is automatically uppercased. I generally, as I'm entering that, I will still enter it as camel case like that. Because I may, down the line, I might want to change my theme to something else that doesn't force it to be uppercase. But the default theme that's applied to buttons will force your button text to be uppercase, which is what's happening here. Okay. Another thing you may notice on the left, you see how I've got my IDs, button, button 2, text view 2. I want to make sure that I go through before I start coding. I want to make sure that I set an ID for each of those. Okay. So typically, as I'm naming controls, I still want to keep in there something that tells me what kind of control it is, because I generally find that useful to know what kind of control it is. So here, this is the toast button. I could call it one of two things. I could either call it button toast or toast button. Either one is a valid. But here I'm going to call it toast button. Now, when I hit enter on there, it's going to ask me if I want to refactor. And part of that, the reason it's asking that is because these constraints kind of already incorporated the ID. So if I don't do this refactor, then my layout is going to break. Okay. So I need to refactor my code because I changed the ID of the button. So I'm going to go ahead. Yep.
Can we use the same naming convention that we did in C# or whatever? The BTN?
You could. Yeah, that would be fine. The one thing I'd ask is that you don't do camel casing, is you separate words with underscores.
Yeah, I put underscore, but I still use BTN.
Yeah, if you want to use BTN toast or toast BTN, either of those is fine, as long as you're separating with underscores. So I'm going to change that to toast button, do the refactor. I'm going to go to the next one. I'm going to call that count button. And then in the middle, I might call this maybe count text. So that's the other reason that I want to generally say what kind of control it is, because I frequently have things like this where otherwise they'd both be called count. You see that? So I have the count text and I have the count button. Everybody got your controls renamed, your ID set?
Yep.
Looking at this, I think there's one last thing I need to do. I already changed the size to 72 and I changed the background color. I haven't changed this to bold, which is what I'm going to do here now. I'm going to change that to bold, and I'm going to change the text color here. I want to change it to another color. Now they say change it to like a blue there. I'm actually going to change it to the same color that's being used for the button. So if I click the little thing here, you see this little box on the right side? That's going to pop up a window and give me some options. So in that window that pops up, it will give me these color values that have been defined already in my application, right? So I'm probably going to change this to purple 500. There we go. And I think I'm going to leave that at 72 SP. Everybody got that? So bold and purple 500 as my color.
Bold and purple 500. What's that text size? 72?
Text size 72 SP. SP, not DP.
Is it okay if we use a different text size to make it bigger?
Absolutely. Let's use the same one so that we're getting the same behavior. So let's all go to maybe 120 SP. The reason is we're going to talk about in a minute. We need to talk about the with I think 1.2b, the next lab. We'll talk about how to do this with tablet orientation and such. So I do want everybody kind of at the same text size, so we're getting the same behavior. So 120 SP, we'll jump up to that. All right, so let's run this on the app. Just make sure that all of those things are good. I should see something like this. If I turn it sideways, it looks like that. So it's basically, for the most part, working, but we'll need to do something about the number when we get in there. Everybody good?
Yep.
Okay. So what we're going to start doing now is we're actually going to start implementing the code for both of those buttons. So let's see, where are we at? Which step are we at? So we've created the project, we added the view elements, changed the UI element attributes. So there we're now add a text view, okay, and layout XML. So I think we're basically down all the way down to step 6 now. So what I want to do, this is, as you see, is kind of the code, is the designer view. This, where that button to change the code view has changed a few times over the past few years. So it used to be that there was a design and a code tab down here, text tab down here. It's actually moved up here. So you see design, split, and code. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
So right now it's in the design view. If I go over to code, it will show me the XML for this view. And you'll notice that we haven't actually written any XML at this point. It's automatically generated all that, which has been a big benefit for the constraint layout. Oftentimes with the constraint layout, you have to do relatively little with the code. Back when we were doing everything with relative layouts, basically designer was almost useless, and we'd spend most of the time in the code and forget the designer actually exists. But constraints layouts actually made it a lot easier to lay things out with the designer. So you can also do split, which what this will do is it'll give you the kind of the designer preview and the code side by side. Anytime I'm doing code, I usually find that one to be the most convenient version, so I can see kind of what my changes are doing. Cool. So what I want to do is I want to go find those buttons, and I want to add on click listeners in there. Now, one of the things you might notice here, what is the order of these controls in the XML? See, I've got the first button, toast button, I've got count button, and I've got count text. Everybody see that? You may not have it in the same order, because by default, the order that these are in is the order that you dragged and dropped them onto the UI. So that as it is can be kind of random, right? If you're just saying, well, let's put all the controls in the order I put them onto the UI, that's not necessarily a great ordering, right? So usually what I want, I find it more convenient and easier to find things once I go into the code view if I arrange these in kind of the order they are from the top to bottom, okay? Now, if I drag things around in this view, they're just going to change where they are graphically. What I want to do is if I take this count button, you see here I'm over in the component tree. In the component tree, I'm going to drag it down. Everybody see what I just did there? So now I've got toast button, count text, and count button. So now they're basically arranged in the order they are kind of graphically appearing. And I usually find that easiest to arrange things kind of left to right, top to bottom. That way they're usually easier to kind of read the XML and figure out what's going on. So once I've dragged those around, you notice that now in the code view, what's happened? Notice that the text view has moved. Does everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's one thing you may want to do is just kind of move things around in the component tree so it makes sense. All right, so in here we've got now the button on top. I want to add a click listener to that. So the easiest way to do that is just to add that on click property. Okay, so I'm going to type that in there. And so what might be a good name for the method I want to call? So this is going to show a toast when you click on the button. What should I call that method?
Activate toast.
Okay, activate toast. What's the verb there?
Show toast.
Show toast.
Burnt toast.
So that's what I would use as show. I'm going to type in show toast there. Now you'll notice that it's in red, and the reason it's in red is because that method doesn't exist. You can kind of see here. That's why. What you can do now in current versions, I believe it's actually hit Alt Enter here. If you hit Alt Enter, you see this second light bulb option. Everybody got that?
Yeah.
So Alt-Enter will give you a lot of suggestions here in Android Studio, works in IntelliJ as well. But you're going to say create show toast in main view. We're going to click on that, and it's actually gone and created the skeleton, the signature of that method for us.
Mr. Smith, can you go back to that next
And so you'll notice that it's no longer red. See that?
Did you get a pop-up that said inspections?
No.
Okay.
So we've got that, and then I'm also going to do the same thing with the bottom button. On click, and so I need to create a new method for this one, right? So what's this going to do? It's going to make the counter go up by 1. So what should I call that method?
Maybe just up count or show count.
Okay.
Count toast.
So it's not going to show a toast. There's no toast involved.
Increased count.
We're
Increased
counting
count.
the toast.
Okay. What term do we usually use when we're saying we're going to increase something by 1?
Increment.
Increment. Yeah. So let's call this increment. So the form that I usually use is verb and then noun. So the verb would be increment. What am I incrementing?
Count.
Increment count. Does that make sense? So what action are you taking, and then what are you performing that on? So it is going to increment the count. So I'm going to hit Alt-Enter again and say create increment count. Cool. So now I have a placeholder for 2 different methods, right? So I have this method's going to get called when I click on the top button, and this method's going to get called when I click on the bottom button. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Okay. So what I want to do now, I'm going to implement this show toast method. If I leave this as is and I run the application, you just click on the button and nothing happens. So I want to make it do something. And so toast, as you maybe have already seen there, is kind of a way to pop up a little message, generally used for debugging. But it's visual rather than the logs. The logs you have to look in your terminal, your logcat down here, but the toast you can actually see on the device. So the way I create a toast is there's 2 methods you have to call on toast. You have to call first make text, and then you have to call show. I'm actually going to do this all in one line because I feel like it's easier to read that way. So I'm going to call this toast.makeText. Make text, remember, takes 3 arguments. So the first argument is a context, which in this place refers to the activity. That means to refer to its activity context. So I'm going to put in this. The next thing is the message that I want it to show. So I'm going to tell it to just show the text toast. And then the third thing I need to give it is the duration. Now, the way I specify the duration is using one of 2 constants. So I'm going to use toast.long or toast.short. Remember, short is usually about a second. Long is longer than that. So I usually use the long duration most of the time. So that will make a toast, but it won't actually appear on screen. If I just stop there, put a semicolon, you won't actually see anything appear on screen. So I could, let's say I'm going to actually run it at this point just to make that point clear. If you just call make text, see, nothing happens when I hit count, when I hit the toast button. So you need to actually call show to make it appear. And I can chain those, so I'm just going to call them here. And chain those 2 method calls together. So now it appears, that word toast appears, and then it kind of goes away. And that's because this is the text I have here is toast. Questions on that?
Amazing.
So that kind of a minor thing, but it's really, really useful for testing because you can see, well, did my button even get clicked, right? Because oftentimes you're like, well, did this thing happen or that thing happen? And that can be very helpful to kind of figure out what's going on.
I don't know if I missed something, but
Mhm.
my text is not showing.
Okay.
when I-
Did you call make text and then show?
Yeah,
Okay. Have
I
you
have everything you have, so.
have you checked that you're on click listeners there? That it says on click.
Yep.
Okay. When you look at either of those two files, are you seeing any errors? Anything marked in red?
No.
Okay. If you share your screen, we can maybe take a look at it.
You gotta give me a second because I'm coding on my laptop and I am on Discord on my thing. So give me a second.
Okay. Then never mind. We'll look at it later then. But that should be all you need to do. I'm not sure specifically what you're running into, but we can look at that later.
Now, why is there on your screen? Why is there no 0 there? I'm having trouble getting mine to appear. I've caught up, I think.
Yeah. So there's no 0 there because I set it with. Let me go back to design. You see, there's two options for text. I put it into this one with the wrench, not the regular one.
Ah, okay.
So that one only shows up in the designer.
Okay, how did you get it, the whole thing yellow again?
I set the background color.
For the text view?
For the text view, yeah.
How'd you expand it, though? That's where I got stuck before.
Match constraints. So it's 0 dp on both sides. All right, so we've implemented that. What we'd like to do now is get it to actually the second button to work, right? So let's do a quick check here. Things I'm going to need to add, first of all, some variables here to track the fields that I'm interested in. And generally, remember, if we're creating instance variables, we're going to mark those as private. Okay, so I'm going to say private and then the type of the control. So in order to show text into the text view, well, I need a reference to that text. And then here, I would say maybe, I think I called that count. So generally in the view, I use underscores to separate my words, but then I'll use camel cases here for the variables.
Mr. Smith, whenever I launch my phone now, I have like a problem saying that this device not. It says uninstalling will remove application data. Do you want to uninstall the existing application? Blah blah blah.
That means that when you created your project, you didn't give it the right package name. That means you probably created your project as Hello World, not Hello Toast, which means that it has to uninstall the Hello World program that you installed yesterday.
I have it as Hello Toast though.
Okay. I don't. That's my speculation. I would just say yes, you want to uninstall it. But that would be my guess, is that your package names are wrong.
Text view is in red? Yeah, how come?
On
mine it is.
That would mean that you don't have all your constraints in. So you need to have a constraint on all those four corners, all those four edges.
On the yellow or all of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the yellow. So you'll see that if you look at my blueprint here, you'll see that I have kind of a constraint on all four edges of the text view. So it'll be in red if you don't have the proper constraints in there. Okay, so what I want to do is I need a reference to that control. I don't actually need any references to the buttons, right? Because at the moment I'm not doing anything with the buttons. So in general, you don't have to get a reference to everything. Sometimes it can be helpful to go ahead and create a reference to everything. But in here, the only one I have to reference is actually the text view itself. I'm going to go ahead and add the other ones just so for illustration purposes, so you kind of know how to do that. So in here, I might say private. This would be toast. And by the way, mine's automatically updating the imports here as I type along, because there's actually a setting that you can do to automatically do that. And I believe that's up here, file settings. I believe that's under editor. But I forget where I had to change that. Let's see, where is that? Auto import. There it is. So if you go to, in the settings, general editor, auto import, you can actually in here, you can say add unambiguous imports on the fly. You see that checkbox there?
Yeah, that actually fixed my text view issue.
Yeah, same here. I saw I had a constraint of 8 on the corners of the yellow box. I don't know what the issue was.
I don't know then. So that generally makes the text a little quicker to write if it can just automatically add some of those imports for you. Cool. So that's kind of laid out. I have these fields here, but remember, unless I give those a value, these are still going to be null. Okay. So if I were to just stop here, all 3 of these fields are null. Everybody got that?
Yeah.
So effectively what I need to do is I need to populate those. Now in Android, we don't write constructors when you're working with activities. So if you try to say, for instance, main activity, let's try to put a constructor and try to get the views here, we can't actually do it in the constructor because that happens far too soon. That happens before anything's on screen or before the controls exist. So we don't actually we don't generally write constructors for our activities and such because the code would run at the wrong time. So what we do instead is code that we want to, like we normally would put it in a constructor, we actually put in this method called onCreate. So inside of onCreate, I need to go get those 3 controls. So I'm going to start with toast button is the name of my control there. So toast button equals, and the method you want to use then is find view by ID.
Mr. Is toast button the name of your button for toast? I thought you said you didn't want camel casing for the
Well,
ID.
that's the name of my variable. See, so
Gotcha.
my variable is using camel casing, but my ID is using underscores. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So I'm using one convention for my XML, and I'm using another convention for my Java.
As long as what we type in doesn't throw an error, we know we're in good standing, right? Because I can't remember exactly how I did it.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say just because it doesn't throw an error doesn't mean that you're good. I would not say make that assumption. So that's how find view by ID is the method you use to go get the element from the view and then save it and then be able to reference it in your code. Now, in general, we're always going to do this find view by ID. The only place that you want to call this is on create. So it happens once because as it turns out, find view by ID can be a kind of expensive call. So by doing this just once, we're not repeating this.
Okay. Can you show where you named it toast button and it with camel case and then with the underscore? Because I just want to make sure I'm doing this
It's
the
up
right
here.
way.
So you see if I go select the
Uh-huh.
view, you see where it says ID toast button. That's where
ID.
it's with the underscore.
That's the underscore. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And where is it? The other one. Just oh, okay, from
Line
up there.
13.
Okay. All right, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is the thing on the left. This is a member variable. This is an ID in the XML. So that kind of links those up. So I need to do the same thing with the other two controls. So that'll link those two pieces up. Now you'll notice I mistyped something here. Count button, count text. You notice how things are in red? So it's actually pretty smart nowadays. Android Studio actually knows that count text is a text view and count button is a button. So it's actually giving me error because the data types are wrong. So here I need to actually change that to count button. Now, one of the things you might notice in my code here, notice I'm not doing any explicit casts. You see that? I'm not doing any explicit casts with those 3 lines. If you go back and watch the video and look at the examples, you'll notice that they did some explicit casts in there. Does everybody remember that? Where were those explicit casts? Where were they located?
That was I don't remember.
Okay. So if you go back and look at the examples, the videos, you'll notice that they write it like so. That they have to take find view by ID and cast it based on what kind of control it is. Okay. So what does that do? What does that do? That says take whatever comes out of here and treat it as this other data type. Do you see that? Now, it used to be that find view by ID always returned view. Okay. Find view by ID always returned view, which is why we had to cast it, right? Because otherwise we would have had a view over here on the right and we were saving it to a variable that's type button.
Because button is part of the view class.
Yeah, because as button and text view, all the controls are subclasses of view. So we had to downcast. Well, with recent versions of Android, I believe this is down to part of this is why we're doing 5.0 or later. That actually is no longer a requirement. It's no longer best practice to cast it. Because what's happened is find view by ID has actually changed. So if I go,
that's the same logic that it knows count text is not the right thing.
Right.
It can't
It's
be
related. It's related. So if I look at find view by ID, look at what it returns. It doesn't return view anymore. It returns type T. So find view by ID is now actually generic. And because it's been genericized, and thanks to some improvements with generics in Java 7, it's actually able to figure out how to do that conversion. So it doesn't actually have to do a cast. Is everybody with me on that? So you won't see me cast it if I'm writing this code, and I would recommend that you don't do casts like that. Cool? Questions? Any questions? Okay. So basically, if you're trying to use a view, you've got 3 steps. First of all, you need to declare it up here. And then you can go and grab it, go find it in your onCreate. And then the last step is to actually use it in your place where you want to use it. So down here in increment count, let's say, well, we want to set the text in there to something else. So I'm going to just say, for the minute, I'm going to say, let's change it to the word count. So when you click on the increment button, the text should change to the word count. You should see something like that. Questions so far?
I looked away for a second. So when you launched that after writing line 32, did you have to hit the?
I did have to hit the button.
You do. Okay, it's never live, right? You always have to hit the button.
That's kind of my question. So when you hit the button, I get a pop-up that says process app is running. Do you want to terminate the process app? I mean, I've been hitting cancel and it launches again. I don't know.
So my guess there is more than likely you probably have an error in your code. My guess is probably you have something like this line here is probably not right. So let's say I run that with there and watch what happens. Unfortunately, Hello Toast has stopped. Do you see that? So I think it's basically telling you that your app crashed.
But I'm getting it in Android Studio, though. Like, it says that the app is currently running.
Okay.
Just terminate one of the options.
Oh, yeah. You want to just say, yes, you do want to terminate it.
Terminate? Okay.
Yeah. So on that note, if you do ever get that case, right, so in that I didn't have a reference to count text, you may want to debug. So if I hit here, you see it says, unfortunately, it stopped. There's really no info if you're just looking at the device about why it crashed. But what you can do is go over to Logcat, and if I look in Logcat, there'll be a stack trace here. So does everybody see that stack trace here? And if I look in here, it says null pointer accepted, attempted to invoke. I tried to call set text on a null object, right? So if I'm reading this message, null pointer exception, and I try to call set text on something that's null, what does that tell me about this line of code? What does it tell me my problem is? What is null according to that? Well, it's count text. It's the thing I'm trying to call the method on. Is everybody with me there? So if you see that, if you see null pointer exception, that generally means that you didn't do something right up here. Cool? Or you're missing that part of it.
Is it common in the Logcat that you get the same line over and over and over again?
Yep, very common.
What's going on there?
It's just there's a lot of other traffic happening on the device.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's other apps that are running and constantly logging stuff. So I usually have to filter this down like we looked at yesterday. So I might filter this down to just my app. Okay, so that will let me change the text that's there. Okay, So the next thing I want to do is I want to actually get it to count, right? I want it to actually count, right? So one of my issues there, okay, how can I track the count? Where do I need to store the count? I need to have a variable for the count, right?
As a private field.
Huh?
As a private field.
Private field, right? So up here, I need to declare a place to store the count. Probably be an integer. I'm just going to call it count. Okay, so I've got my count up here. Now I probably want to start it as maybe started at 0. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start the count at 0. Another thing I want to do is when the app initially launches, I want to go ahead and set the text to 0. So back in on create, the first thing I'll do here once I've gotten all my views, I'd like to show the count. Okay, that's my goal. Okay, now looking at this, is my compiler is Android Studio telling me that there's anything wrong with line 27? Are there any errors showing up on line 27?
No.
There are not. Okay, but if I try to run this program, you're going to see that it crashes because this is a common mistake that people make. Okay. And this is actually one of those places where we talk about overloads. Overloads are actually really dangerous. Method overloading can be very dangerous because what's happening here is there's 2 versions of set text. Okay, this version of set text, what am I passing into it?
String.
I'm passing a string. What am I passing here?
An int.
An int. Those are different versions of set text. So there's a version of set text that takes an integer, and there's a version of set text that takes a string. Okay. Now, if I look and go look, say right click and go to implementation, what we'll see is the version that takes an integer is actually an ID for a resource. It isn't what it doesn't do. It's not taking that number and then turning it into a string. It's treating that number that we give it as an ID for a resource, a string resource, which because it's 0, well, there's no string with that ID. So what it's actually doing is when it runs, it tries to find a string resource with ID 0, and it says, I can't do that, crash. Does that follow? So what I actually need to pass here is not, I have to myself take this integer and I have to turn it into a string. Does anybody remember how to do that? How can I take an integer and turn it into a string?
String that value of.
Okay, that will work. So now if I run it, it's not going to crash. Is everybody with me on that? That's one of those things that a lot of times trips people up. It's like, well, I passed it an integer, but it crashed. Like, why? What's happening? The problem is there's 2 overloads. There's 2 versions of set text, and they don't behave the same way. So generally speaking, and this is a word of warning for any language you work with, and be very careful of overloads because you don't want to, if you're going to write an overload where it does one thing with one argument and then does a different thing with another argument, another data type, they probably should be called different methods. So in reality, This should really be called set text resource or something along that lines. The version that takes an integer probably should not be called the same name, but it is, so watch out. Okay, so now that I've got that, what do I need to do in increment count?
Wait, Mr. Smith, couldn't we have done count.toString?
No, because primitive types are not objects and therefore they don't have methods.
Oh, okay.
You can do integer.toString and pass that in there, but no, there's not, like, you can't do count.toString. That's not supported in Java. So what do I want to do in increment count? What is our goal here? Every time I push the button, I want the count to go up by 1.
Count plus plus.
Okay. Or in this case, count plus count is the same thing, which is what I'm going to write. So plus count, and then what? What do I want to set the text to?
The same thing you said earlier on line 27.
Right. Yes. So we click the button and it goes up. So I'm going to run that. Let's run that program and let's see if it works. So I keep clicking and it looks like the count's going up. Okay. So that's working, right? Everybody got that same behavior? Everybody up to that point?
Yep.
Now, do this. Do an experiment for me. Change the orientation here. Use one of these buttons. Change it to landscape. What's the number after that? Does it stay 22?
It resets.
It resets. It resets to 0. Do you see that? So there's a problem in Android, and this is one that we'll talk about how to fix in the coming weeks. But there's a problem in Android. Anytime you change the orientation of your layout, your activity actually gets completely destroyed and recreated. So just by turning it this on the side, this whole activity is getting destroyed and a brand new activity is getting created. Everybody hear that? So that brand new
So that's interesting.
Yes, and it's unfortunate. So that brand new activity doesn't have any of the state that the activity had. It's lost all that state. So this instance variable that we have here that was storing the count, it didn't get saved and it didn't get in that process. So we've lost that number. So there's some finagling. There's some tools that we have to use in Android to actually keep state when you change the orientation, and that's actually a pretty big deal.
Mr. Smith, aren't we just going to separate like each activity into a different scene?
No, each activity is a different screen. An activity is a screen, remember?
Yeah. Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So there's some methods and there's some tools that we have to learn to know how to solve that problem of preserving states through orientation change. So we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. I think that the place that we really get in, I feel like the place we get into that is actually in Unit 2. But that'll take some time to unpack how we solve that problem. And there's actually more than one solution. Okay, so we've got that resolved. Is there anything else left that we need to do for this lab? So we've got the on-click listeners, they work. Okay, yep, that's fine. So was there one other thing? I feel like there's another thing we needed to look at before we leave here. Well, one thing you'll obviously notice, if I turn it sideways, you see what's happening with the text? So everybody see what's happening in landscape?
Yeah, the field's getting smaller.
The fields, yeah.
Like
well,
it's being cut off.
The text is being cut off. So the problem is basically that the font size is too big for landscape. So for instance, one way around that, and probably the easiest way to do that, is to just say, well, let's change the text size overall to be something smaller so that it works. So for instance, if I go back to 72S, and then run it again, that's going to make it smaller, so it'll be less likely to kind of fall off the edge. So if I turn it sideways now, you can see that it still fits.
How did you center it like that?
I use the gravity. I set the gravity to center.
That's one of the fields, gravity?
Yeah, that's one of the attributes down here.
And Toast, all it does is display a message still, right?
Yep, that's all it does.
Are we going to do anything with Toast? Like, are we going to say, boom, it's toasted?
If you want to, just change it to something else. Maybe I'll change it to short and rerun it. Now, one of the things you want to kind of watch, and if you've been paying attention already, you'll see that there's some indication on this potentially, and back in the text, you see the warnings. You see that little exclamation mark on your resources?
Yeah, I noticed that earlier, but I was like, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. So what does the message say? It says hard-coded string text toast. You should use a string resource instead. The problem here, and the reason why it's giving us a warning, is because in the XML file, I've hard-coded this string toast. And same thing with the button on the bottom, I've hard-coded the string count. I don't want to hard-code strings in general in my program, because I want to be able to translate or localize this program into other languages. And if I have hard-coded values here, I can't translate my application. So what you want to do is you want to take that and extract it into a string resource. Now, the good news with that is there's an easy way to do that. Unfortunately, there's not a way to do it from the designer. So I actually always go ahead and do this over in the code view. So everybody here with me in the code view?
Yep.
So you remember with Alt on click, I had this magical key Alt Enter that gave me a suggestion. Well, it's the same thing here. If you click on the word toast, hit Alt Enter, you should get an option that says extract string resource. Everybody got that? So extract string resource, it's going to give you a pop-up here. It's going to give you, here's the value, that's the string that was already there, and it's going to ask me to give it a name. So the name I want to give it is generally the name of the control plus some sort of thing. So for instance here, I'm actually going to call this toast. And some people like to say, maybe this is toast button text. Is oftentimes the term that gets used, because this is the text for that button. So everybody got me? Follow with me there?
Yeah.
So I'm going to call the resource toast button text. I'm going to leave everything else the same. You will notice that it's going to put this into values and strings.x. So we'll see in a minute where that went. I'm going to hit OK. Now notice what it's replaced it with. Okay, so rather than having that word toast directly here, it's actually a reference to somewhere else. So it says @string toast button text. Do you see that? So one of the things you want to make sure you do is you extract all of your strings, all of these hard-coded strings, to string resources. Okay, so we've got that.
How would you get back to it?
Huh?
How would you get?
We'll look at the resource in a minute.
Okay.
I'll show you where it is. So I want to get toast toast button text is the one I called here. So I'm going to do the same thing with the count button. I'm going to call that count button text and extract it. Okay. So you got both of those things extracted, right? Both of those strings extracted. So where did they go, right? So this is, as I said, it's a reference to a resource. If I go into my project, you see there's the resource folders. You saw in that dialog maybe some reference to values. So if you go res, values, and then strings.xml, this is where it moved those strings. Do you see that in strings.xml?
Mr. Smith, can you go back to that one more time?
This is count button text here.
Yeah.
And so here's where it put that string. Put it over in the strings.xml file.
Okay, so if you just deleted line 4, it would just undo what we did, or not?
No, it wouldn't. Let's say I comment line 4 out. So now that resource is gone. If I go back here, it's in red because, well, that it's still referencing that resource, but the resource no longer exists. Does that make sense?
All right, so it would throw an error, it just wouldn't work.
You couldn't compile this. If I try to run this program, it'll tell me I can't do this because that resource doesn't exist. So no, undoing it is not as easy as commenting that out.
Yeah, you just have to delete that new thing it automatically wrote, and then just go back to hard coding it.
Yeah.
And Mr. Smith, in resource value, do we just put what the text was?
Yes, that should be pre-populated. Resource value is the text that was there, but it should have already put the right value there. So those are the two string resources I needed to extract. Notice that it doesn't give me an error on the text view because I used that other form to set the text. Because I set the text only in the designer, not at runtime, it didn't ask me to create a string resource for that 0. Does that make sense? If I had set that as in the if I had set that to be used at runtime, then I would have also had to needed to extract that resource as well. So other things I might want to do, oftentimes things like this, we've got the text boom. Generally, we don't want to have hard-coded text there, whether it's in the layout or whether it's in our code. So this I would also like to extract. So similarly here, I believe that you can do Alt-Enter and get it. There it is. So extract string resource. And so I would export this as maybe the toast text or the toast message. So you can do the same sort of thing for extracting strings from your code as well.
What's that I saw in the pop-up there? There's create the resource in directories values and values night. What's that values night?
That's your night, like your night view.
Like a dark mode or something?
It's like your dark mode, but it actually it comes on after sundown. So it actually your Android device automatically switches between night and day mode, between sunrise and sunset.
Yeah, if you use that, of course.
Yeah.
I got an error whenever I did the exporting it or whatever to resource. Toast text. It broke the make text. It says that it's pulling the main activity question mark and then an int.
All you have to do is hit run and the error will go away. as soon as you run the application, that error will go away.
If only all the errors could go away like that.
Yeah. It's a bug in Android Studio, basically. It should have recompiled the program at that point, but it didn't recompile. That's been an issue in Android Studio for a while.
It's still underlined, although it is working.
Okay.
So is that okay?
My error went away when I ran it.
Okay.
So that is, I think that's all of this 1.2a coding challenge. Okay, so there is a coding challenge that I would like you guys to do. Go ahead and don't do this one yet, but go ahead and kind of save this. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a copy for the challenge. You're going to create a copy of this project. You're going to call it Hello Toast Challenge, put it into the 1.2 folder. And what you're going to do is you're going to change the layout using constraint layout to look like this. So everybody see that? So that's one of your lab assignments for tonight, is to do that.
To make it look like that?
Yep. To make another version of it, call it Hello Toast Challenge, because we still need to keep this version. So you have Hello Toast and Hello Toast Challenge. And that Hello Toast Challenge will look like this instead. And that, basically, this works better on, this layout is going to be designed to work better in like landscape and on tablets.
Can you post a picture of it in Discord?
Yep. Posted. So let's take a quick look at 1.2b. So I want to get back to 1.2b. And so we got about an hour to try and finish up this one. Yeah. Okay, so let's run through this, and we're going to kind of run through this quickly. We've already built one version of the application, and so that version works just fine on phones, right? It works just fine on this Nexus. Everybody with me on that? But it doesn't work as well on other layouts. So for instance, if we're looking at it on a tablet, let me run this with my 10-inch. I hope you can see that this doesn't work as well. It's not as user-friendly because I'm wasting a lot of space here, and maybe these buttons, I don't want them to be the full width of the screen. Does everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. So what 1.2b is going to go through, what we're going to go through there is how to make a layout that's different on different screen sizes and such. What we call it is a layout variant. So we have our regular layout, but we're going to make two variants of this layout. We're going to make one variant that we're going to use for tablets, and we're going to create another layout, I believe, for landscape. And what actually the way that Android works is it automatically switches between those different layout variants, which is actually kind of cool. So there's actually no code we have to write to make this work. We're just going to make some additional layouts.
Are we creating a new file, or are we just adding this on top of the original?
this will be it. We're going to make some new files, but this is going to be still on this Hello Toast program. So for 1.2b, we're not creating a separate project.
Okay, because I already pushed the original Hello Toast for the first part. I didn't know if you were creating part.
That's good. Yeah. So go ahead. You can push this or whatever. Now would actually be a really good time to do that. So let me go ahead and commit my code here. And so I might say down here, I want to make sure I do commit and push. So maybe I'll do, this is,
Didn't you also say to commit the unversion files as well?
yes. Yeah, you want to commit those as well.
Okay.
So you want to check all those. Because that'll include actually your code. If you don't check the unversion files, then that won't include any of the Java code that we wrote for the layouts. So we're going to check all that, and then I'm going to go down here, and I'm saying commit and push. And I'm going to go ahead and bypass those errors. Okay, and here we're going to go ahead and hit push, and that should have uploaded the code. So we're going to go through a few things, and basically the end result is the only thing we're really going to do for this lab 1.2b is we're going to create 2 additional layouts. And then the Java code is going to change. That's the only thing we're doing. So what you want to do once you get your code pushed is you want to go back to the layout, back to the layout designer here, because that's where we're going to do the rest of our work. So once you get to this point, you've got your code pushed and you've got the designer pulled back up. Then go ahead and thumbs up my post on Discord.
Oh wait, we're doing the challenge together?
We're doing the next lab, which is 1.2b.
I've got a recurring problem I've noticed is that things just don't take right away. Like, for example, I'll make a change and I'll launch the app and it won't work the first or second time.
Probably you need to hit enter.
Okay.
Anytime you make a change over here in the attributes, hit enter to commit that change.
Okay, it goes beyond that too, like that error that was there in the red, that last thing. I launched it 3 times and it finally went away, and I don't know what I did different, but it's hard to know when I get it right because it doesn't change right away,
My guess is that your computer's just running slow, and so I would look at closing any other apps that you have open, and I would also make sure that all your antivirus exclusions are in there, which was in the setup guides. Probably you're not excluding a folder, which is making it go slower because your antivirus is scanning one of those folders constantly.
Okay. Now I got it stripped down pretty bare. I mean, I don't even have the browser running.
Okay. We can look at it offline and see if we can make it go faster. But my guess is that it's such and such related, like antivirus and such. Okay, so our goal here is we're gonna just we're gonna make 2 copies of this layout that are gonna be for those different variations. So we've looked at some of this stuff already. One of the buttons I already showed you is this one that will change the orientation. What we're going to use is another function underneath that button. Okay, so if you click on this button here, you see there's a drop down. right? And you see there's a bunch of other options within that drop down. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do first, let's see. So we're going to create we're going to create a landscape variation is the first one here. So we're in portrait right now. I'm going to click create landscape variation. Okay. And so now it's asking me if I want to add this new layout to Git. You can add it now or you can add it later. That's really up to you. I'm going to go ahead and say add it now. So if you look into layout now, you'll notice there's sort of an interesting folder structure, right? So under layout, I have this folder, at least what looks like a folder labeled activity main. Does everybody see that?
Can you go over where you clicked again? I kind of missed it.
So it's the orientation here. I said create landscape variation.
Oh, okay.
So what we see here now, activity main is the name of the activity, the name of the layout, but there's two versions of it underneath here. So there's activity main. This is the default one, which default is always portrait. And then we've got a landscape variation, and you can know that by it's got this little land in parentheses. Does everybody see that now?
Yep.
So the way this works is Android will automatically switch between the portrait version and the landscape version. And actually, this is precisely one of the reasons that when you switch the orientation, it has to it has to destroy the activity and recreate it, because you might be switching layouts if you change the orientation. So in order to support that change in layout, that's why it has to destroy the thing and recreate it. Everybody with me? So now what I can do is I can change this version of the layout without affecting the portrait orientation. Everybody got me? So I can change that one here. And other thing you will notice, if I change the orientation, you notice that these buttons have changed labels. So now when I switch portrait, it's actually changing layouts. It's not just changing my view of it, it's actually changing from one file to another. Everybody see that? So it's not just previewing it differently, it's actually giving me a different file to edit. So in the landscape orientation, where are we at? So what, I want to see if they've got a preview of where we're going. Yeah. There we go. So this is the layout that we want to create for landscape. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I want to do to start this out, I'm going to keep all of these same controls, and I want to keep the same IDs for them and such. So rather than what I don't want to do for sure is I don't want to say let's delete all these controls. What I want to do is I want to kind of use them to start with and just move them around. Now, the first thing you want to do though, so rather than deleting them, I want to delete all the constraints. So there's a button up here. You see the little squiggly there, connected dots with an X?
Yeah.
So that will remove all the constraints in the layout. So now there's no more constraints here, which means I can move everything around freely. Everybody got it? So click clear all constraints. And what we're going to do is then we're going to move this around a little bit here. So I'm going to move that over on there. We're going to move the count button. I'm going to resize a little bit, move it over there. And then we're going to kind of position this here. Now, as I did that, if you pay close attention to all the different components, notice that they all have fixed widths now. Everybody see that? So they're no longer wrap content, they're no longer match parent. Everybody got that?
Yeah.
So we're going to obviously have to fix that in a moment. So we want to make sure that we get those back to wrap content and match parent instead of being fixed dimensions. Okay. So what I want to do is then anchor these buttons and anchor the text views. What should I anchor first? Because order does matter. What should I probably anchor first?
Probably the buttons.
Okay.
I take toast button
Okay, so the toast button. Why should I do that one first?
because it's first in your component tree, like in your layout.
Okay, that's not really a good reason. Not based on this, because normally, remember, that's just based on the order I added them to the view. This is my goal here, right? So a good rule of thumb is maybe start from the top left corner. Does that make sense? So if we start with the top left corner and work down, that's usually a good place to start. Okay, so if I want to anchor the toast, one way I can do this is I can just say boop, boop, right? Does that make sense? Anchor the top left. What about the count? How should I anchor count?
To the top and then to toast.
Okay, so the top and then the toast. And remember, the order matters, so don't do toast to count. Because if you see what happens if I do that way, this way, count still has no horizontal constraint. There's still nothing telling it where it needs to be. Instead, toast is being told to be halfway between here and that. And so you'll get an error if you do it this direction saying that, well, count doesn't know where to be. So I want to make sure that I push that count and anchor it there. Okay. All right. So next up, what about the text view? Where should I anchor the text view?
Mr. Smith, my 0 just like disappeared.
Okay. You may need to change. You may need to go over here, and you may need to change its width and height. It might got them down to 0, so you might need to give it a fixed width, maybe 100 dp by 100 dp, so you can see it. Okay. So where should we anchor? Where should we anchor this text view? Where do we need to add constraints? Maybe start from the left, right? Where should we anchor the left side of the text view?
To the left wall.
Okay, so let's anchor it to the left wall. What about the bottom?
To the bottom of the screen.
Okay, that sounds good. What about the right?
To the right side.
Right side of the screen. Okay, so we've got that. What about the top? Where should we anchor the top? Because we
at the bottom edge of the buttons, that horizontal line, but the buttons aren't the same height.
Right.
So we gotta put a constraint on both buttons, yeah?
Well, I can only put one constraint on the top of this text view. I can't put two constraints. I only get one constraint. So here's some options. I can only create one constraint here. I can either create it to the toast, I can create it to the count, or I can create it to the top of the view, the top of the layout. Which of those three?
Count.
Okay. So why count?
Because if anything, it's not cropping anything out.
Okay. So in that case, you're saying count basically because right now the count is taller, right? So
Yeah.
that's that. Well, I would say, okay, that's fine, but I that's just because I haven't fixed the height of count yet. Okay. What about here? Why might I not want to anchor it to the top of the screen?
Because it's gonna overlap the count.
Okay. What if I do this?
It's not going to be the same on all devices.
Okay, you're sort of right. But if I say it's maybe 70 dp from the top or something on that lines, it's actually going to be 50 dp from the top from all screens on all screens. It'll still be 50 dp from the top. The problem is it's not constrained relative to the size of the buttons, because what if the buttons change in size? Okay, and one of the reasons the buttons could change in size is if you're translating it to another language. So for instance, if I'm trying to put this into Spanish, oftentimes that requires a lot more words. So this text may take up a lot more space, which in turn means the buttons are taller. Does that make sense? So it may end up that the buttons are taller because you change language. So that would be the reason that I would anchor it to one of them. And as it turns out, in the end, it won't really matter too much which button we hook it to. You can hook it to toast, or you can hook it to count. It's really the same difference. It really won't matter. Okay. So I'm going to hook it to toast. And remember that I mentioned when we started dragging all this around, all of these got assigned fixed widths, right? So how do I fix this so that it doesn't have a fixed width anymore? So it takes up as much space as available. What do I need to change?
Yeah, make it match parent.
You're close.
0, whatever that 0 thing is.
Which is match constraint. So I'm going to set the height and width of that to match constraint. Does that make sense? So it's going to take up whatever space is available. And what do I need to do for this button?
Wait, Mr. Smith, you added 0 to the constraint height widget?
Yep.
On the sides? Okay.
Yep. So these are the width and the height is 0 for the text view.
Yeah. So, one thing, I don't know if everybody else got this, but my 0's off to the left, but gravity is center. So is there something wrong there?
Your what is off to the left?
The 0, it's off to the left. It's centered vertically, but not horizontally.
So then what you need to do is change your alignment, text alignment. It's right here.
Okay.
Hold on a second. So we've changed that. What do we want to set what should we set the width here to for that button? What would be a good width for the button? Given that we want it to look like this.
A good width, like 130?
Okay.
I've got mine set for 122.
What if I want to change this to Spanish?
Oh.
So we want to avoid fixed widths and anytime we can, right? In this case, we still can. So what can we set it to that will be relative to the size of the text?
Match constraint.
Well, okay. So if I say match constraint, problem there is it's potentially going to go down to 0. So I actually want to do is I want to set that to wrap content, because wrap content is relative to the size of the text. Similarly for height, I'm going to set that to wrap content. So for both of these, I'm going to make that wrap content. Cool. So now that I've fixed that, you can see that it's not like the text view is not overlapping that. Questions?
Would you want that box with the yellow box to be touching the edge?
That's really up to you. It's really up to you. Oftentimes I would put a margin in there, but in this case, is there anything that you can actually click on or interact with on the edge?
Yeah, right. Okay.
So it doesn't really matter. I think stylistically it looks better without a margin there. But as far as that's concerned, you can go either way. So that's kind of a subject call there because there's nothing actually happening on the edges in this case.
Is there any percentage styling? Like, let's say you wanted the toast and the count. Forget about the words that are in there. It'd be, say, like, I don't know, 25%? No, there's no way.
There is, but you probably don't want to use it.
Okay.
What we can do, there is a way for us to say both of those occupy effectively 50%. So we can actually stretch these out to fill the full width, and I'll show you how to do that. The one thing I want to point out here, and this is one of the things on this lesson that they wanted to show you. So far, we've used vertical constraints. We've hooked the left and right and top and bottom edges. We've hooked those 4 edges up. There is another kind of constraint that you can add with the layout editor. So agree with me so far? So what I'm going to do on the count button, I'm going to right click that one and say clear constraints on selection. So I've removed the constraints not on everything, just on this button. So is everybody with me? So you should have no constraints on this button. All good? So what you want to now do, I'm going to show you how to add what's called a baseline constraint. And this has changed several times where it is. So if you're looking at the lab and it tells you where it is, it's wrong. If you're looking at a lot of documentation on there, it's probably wrong because it just changed in the last year as to where that baseline button is. It's a little bit hidden. Okay. Where you get to it, right click on the control. You see how it says show baseline? Everybody see that? Show baseline?
Yep.
Now, this is only available if both of the controls involved are subclasses of text view, which a button is a subclass of text view. If either of the 2 constraints that you're trying to connect to each other are not text view constraints, you won't be able to connect. You won't be able to connect them with a baseline constraint. So the way this works is you're actually hooking the baseline of this text to the baseline of the text on the other control. And this is why both of these controls need to have text in them, because otherwise there's no baseline defined. So you can do that. Now, the thing that gets people a lot of times with those constraints is that at least the way it looks, the baseline constraint, does it look like it's a horizontal or a vertical constraint? Which of those 2 does it look like? Given the connection.
Horizontal.
It looks like a horizontal constraint. Okay. In reality, a baseline constraint, and definitely make a note of this, a baseline constraint is a vertical constraint. It is a vertical constraint. It does not constrain where the text is left or right. And in fact, if I start dragging this around, you'll notice it doesn't let me drag it up and down. It does allow me to drag it left and right, but I can no longer drag it up and down. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
So what that means is what I have right now on my control is on my count button, I have a vertical constraint. I do not have a horizontal constraint. So if I want to use that baseline constraint, I don't need to add a constraint to the top of the view. I need to add a constraint here. I've got a constraint between the left edge and the right edge of that, and between the baseline here and the baseline there. Was everybody with me?
Not really.
Okay. That's how you use the baseline. So what it's doing, rather than what we had previously, was aligning the top of the buttons to the top of the screen. Now it's aligning the baseline of the text here with the baseline of the text here. Most of the time, those are almost equivalent. Honestly, there are very few cases where you need a baseline constraint, to be blunt. But that is how you set it up if you do need it. Cool? Most of the time you can get away without using baseline, which is, I think, another reason why they've hidden it where it is. So if I remember right, I don't think any of the tests that I have require you to use baseline. So, keep it in your back pocket should you need it, but just recognize that oftentimes there's a better solution. Cool. So the last piece is to think about the width of the button. So I can hold Shift and select them both and kind of change them at the same time. Hold Control and select them both. So I've got them both selected. I can actually change both of their widths at the same time. So that would say change both of their widths to 200. Now, most of the times, I would say make your buttons, you usually want them to be wrap content. That's 90% of the time, is just make them wrap content, and that will be the right answer in both dimensions. But sometimes you do want to play around with them and maybe make them a little bit wider. So what I'd like to do potentially is do one of two things. I'd like to maybe center both of those buttons, or I might want to expand both of those buttons to 50%. And that's one of the things you'd ask about, Paul, right? You'd asked about expanding it out. So what I'm going to do first is I'm actually going to show you how to center it, because that's the key to understand how to make it 50%. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to center the buttons. So before I do that, I'm going to change these to, so they're both 150 dp, and that will help us kind of see what's going on a little bit. And also notice that I have them both selected. You do need to have them both selected in order to do this. So remember, you can hold Control to select multiple things. So does everybody have these two buttons selected?
Yep.
Okay. So there's an option here that will pop up once you have them selected. It won't pop up if you just have a single control selected. What I'm going to do is right click on one of them. And we already went and did show baseline, but there's another option in here called, why am I not seeing, oh, it unselected. So apparently I have to click in the right place. There it goes. So I'm going to go into chains, and I'm going to create a horizontal chain. So a horizontal chain is kind of a magic sort of constraint, and it creates basically double constraints. There's actually going to be a constraint between the left of count and the right of toast, and there's going to actually be two constraints between toast and count after I click this.
How did you get it to get chains?
So what I ended up having to do is right click over here, not on one of the baselines. If I clicked on one of the baselines, it didn't show up. So to select them both and then right click in the right spot.
Mine just unselects them.
So notice what I've done. I've also got 150 dp, and I'm also zoomed in a little bit. So I'm up here in the top left corner. So I'm going to say create horizontal chain, and it's going to create something like this.
Yeah, mine, like, it unclicks when I click off the button, and then if I click on the button, it just selects the
What I would
one.
recommend, the place to start that might make that easier, is to select them both, and you have to kind of be careful about not selecting constraints, so it may be easier to select them over here. What you might want to do is clear the constraints off of the selection first, so you have no constraints to start with. That may make things easier. And then select them both and go chains, create horizontal chain. Now, one thing I need to do here, I need to reintroduce that vertical constraint here. I'm going to reintroduce the vertical constraint there. So I'm not doing baseline anymore. I'm constraining both of those to the top. But you see I have I have something interesting happening with my chain. So you'll see here there's a regular, looks like a spring on the left. Does everybody see that? There's a spring on the left, there's a spring on the right. But in the middle, there's a symbol that we haven't seen before. Does everybody see that symbol in the middle? Everybody got the same thing I do on your screen?
Yep.
So that in the middle is actually a constraint going both ways. And that's part of where you get the idea of like chain. That's what you're going to see when you get chain. So with chains, there's a bunch of different things that you can do. So if you just go right click now, under chains, you should see an option horizontal chain style. So there's 3 different chain styles that you can kind of cycle through. So there's spread inside, and there's pack. Does everybody see those 3?
Yeah.
So what spread is going to do, you can kind of think about it as flexbox, where it's kind of spread evenly. It's going to spread out the space between the center and the edges and spread it out kind of evenly. Spread inside is a similar sort of thing, but it's going to make it so that all the white space is in between, and there's no white space on the edge. So right now it's set to spread. That's the default. If I go spread inside, now all the space is here in the middle. Do you see that? So then the last one I can do is under chains, I can also change it to packed. And so packed is going to put them there, as you can see, in the middle.
Yeah, I figured it would have put a buffer in between them because we got 8 DP selected, or at least I do, up there at by the magnet.
Yeah, my catch is that the way mine's are, my controls are right now, they're both 0 on left and right. If I go fix that, so they're 8 and 8, again, now there's space. But there's actual double space here. There's an 8 and an 8 there, so if I want it to be exactly 8, one of them basically needs to be 8, and the other would be 0, or I could set 4 and 4. Because it's effectively adding both of those margins together. Okay, so you can see how you can kind of center it, and there's actually 3 different kinds of centering. Is everybody with me there?
Not really, but yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to actually go back a mode. I'm going to go back to one of the other others.
You're recording this, right?
Yes, I am.
All right, I have to go to work soon,
Okay.
so.
Yeah. So I'm going to change this to back to spread. And what I can now do is because they're in a chain, I can actually change the width of them to match constraint. That's what you do. So you put them in a chain, you make both of the widths match constraint, and now they'll expand to basically evenly distributed. Good. So that's how you get a, say if you want 50-50, you use a combination of a chain and match constraint. Okay, so now that we've done all that, let's try it. So if we run it on the Nexus S, you should see it's still got that same layout. And if I turn it to landscape, you can see that it gets into this other layout now. Everybody see that? So Android automatically switches between your variants. And in fact, if you test the buttons like toast and count, you'll see that they still work. So for a lot of activities, you may need to potentially create two variants like this. You may need to create a portrait variant as well as a landscape variant. Okay. Questions on variants so far? Okay. So the last thing we want to do here is, now that we've got those two variants, we want to create one more variant for tablets. Okay. So remember how we initially created the first variant. The first variant I created by going to this orientation change and clicking create landscape variant. Remember that? So what I'm going to go down here, you see it? Can everybody see the create tablet variant button?
Yep.
Okay. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a third variant. Okay. So we're going to click create tablet variation. And I'm going to go ahead and add there. So what I have now, if we look at layout, you'll see that there's three different versions. I have my main, my default, my landscape version, and my tablet version. Now, the tablet version, you see it says SW600dB. So that is short for smallest width 600 dp. What that means is, as long as it's going to take the size of the smallest dimension, whether it be the width or the height of the device, and obviously that changes depending on your orientation. It's going to take the smallest dimension. If that smallest dimension is 600 dp or larger, then it will use this variation. Okay, so a quick way I can test this, if I maybe put in the word, let's change the background color of the text view. I'm going to change it to red so we can see where this applies. So my tablet variant now is red. So if I run this with the Nexus S, we should see that there's still no change. So in portrait, it's still yellow. And in landscape, it's those two variants that we created previously. Okay, so it hasn't affected it on phone. But if I run it, if I use either my 7-inch or my 10-inch tablet now, let's say we do the 7-inch tablet, which is basically what your tablets are. We'll go to the 7-inch tablet. What we should see is that it's now in red. See, so if I turn it either way on the tablet, whether it's landscape or portrait, it's using the landscape. It's using the tablet variation. Everybody got that?
Yeah.
So we have 3 different versions of it. So what I'm going to do to make these actually be a little bit different, I'm first of all going to go back to yellow as my background color. I'm just going to reset that and do Control Z to get back to yellow. And what I'm going to do, just like we started the previous one, I'm going to say let's clear all the constraints. Okay, and then let's maybe move it around. So I'm going to clear the constraints, move it around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my toast button in the top left corner here, count there, underneath, and let's do that. Everybody with me? So this is kind of the layout I'm going to use for tablets. So we anchor this to the top, that to the left. Sometimes, especially when I'm working with tablets, things kind of get pretty small. So sometimes you may have to zoom in. You can use the plus button here to zoom in a little bit. That can help you kind of orient and put things around. So I'm going to fix that to there, fix that to the left side. And finally, kind of like what I've done with the previous ones, I'm going to fix 3 of these sides to the edges, top, right, and bottom. I'm going to fix the edge of the screen. And then this left-hand side, I'm going to fix to the edge of toast. Okay. Now that I've put the constraints back in, I'm going to go ahead and change these dimensions. So the width and height of the text view, I'm going to go back to 0 dp, match constraint. And for the toast button, I want to go back to wrap content and wrap content here. Same with the count button, I'm going to go wrap content, wrap content. Now, depending on how this lays out, one of the issues you may kind of see is that these buttons may or may not be the same width. As it turns out, because they're the same number of characters, they do kind of end up in the same place, but although I think, well, as it turns out, they're pretty close. In reality, I usually would want to put a little bit more constraints here. What I'm going to do is actually change both of these buttons to have a fixed width. Maybe we try, say, 150 dp. The benefit of using a fixed width there is because they're kind of horizontally arranged. I want them to, I want their left and right edges, I want them both to be the same width. So in this case, it does actually make sense to kind of force them to a fixed width. So everybody with me there? With the tablet variant.
Yep.
I may also go ahead and say I'm going to put 0 dp for those margins, all except for the left-hand side, so it nestles up to the edges nicely. So if you have all that in place, you should see something like this on tablets and in landscape, and then you're going to see in portrait, it should look something like that. And the one thing we can do here to make this a little bit better is we might want to increase the font size to maybe double that, or maybe 300. Given that we're on a tablet, that can be much more larger. There we go. Does that make sense? So now we've got an app that basically works on landscape or portrait and landscape, portrait, and tablet with 3 different layout variants. So sometimes you'll need to do that for screens to get to really scale, to scale well between different devices. You may need to create a few different versions of the layout. So you may have to play around with that there. Sometimes you can get away with just one variant because you can kind of make it work for any side, and that's what I usually recommend. If you can make one variant and it's all going to be the same, then just make one variant. The only reason you need to make more than one variant is if they actually need to be different. So everybody with me there? So especially if you're looking at the lab assignments or looking at the tests, unless you really need a different layout for different screen sizes, I would stick with just one. Cool.
Cool.
So, but that's what you can do. You do have the flexibility in Android to create a bunch of different layouts that it will automatically switch between. But the nicest thing there is, notice as we have all those versions, notice that nowhere in there did I have to change the Java code, right? So all of that was just UI stuff. All of that was the front end. The back end stayed completely agnostic of that. And that should always be your goal, is that the back end does not know anything about how the front end is arranged. Cool. So you have your challenge. Is there a, let's see, is there a coding challenge to go with this one? Okay, no, you don't need to do a challenge for this one. So the coding challenge for 1.2b, I'm not going to ask you to do. It's just the coding challenge for the first one. But that's all we need to do today for this. And the whole process. So yay. So your assignment for finish up the labs for today and going in tomorrow is just to go back to 1.2a and go to that last step. Basically, go to the coding challenge and do that. That's your one lab you need to do tonight. Questions? Anything?
Nope.
Okay.
I just need a little help with my setup. Something's
Yeah.
not right afterward.
Yeah, we can do that here in a minute.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
So any questions before we call it a day? Do make sure you get your code turned in for attendance purposes. That includes you, Zach.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, I'm gonna shut down my recording here.